I still remember the exact moment my parents destroyed my future. Christmas Eve. Our living room packed with relatives and neighbors. My father stood in the center like a king addressing his court, holding up a letter like it was made of gold. "Savannah has been accepted to Harvard," he announced, his voice booming with pride. "Full academic scholarship, $120,000. The room exploded with applause. My twin sister, my identical twin, was showered with hugs, congratulations, tears of joy. And me, I stood in the corner, invisible, forgotten. The daughter who got rejected. The one heading to a no-name college nobody had ever heard of. My mother caught my eye across the room. She didn't offer comfort. Instead, she walked over and whispered words that would haunt me for years. "Your sister is the pride of this family. You're a disgrace." I believed them. For 6 long years, I believed I simply wasn't good enough. I worked 3 jobs to pay for my worthless degree. I clawed my way up from nothing while Savannah lived the golden life I was told I didn't deserve. Then one day, I discovered a document that changed everything. The Harvard acceptance letter had my name on it. My name. The scholarship was mine. And my father's signature. It was forged on the rejection I supposedly sent. They didn't just favor my sister, they stole my entire future and handed it to her. What I did next. Let's just say my parents never saw it coming. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why some betrayals can only be answered with total destruction. My name is Shelby Torres. I'm 30 years old now, the founder of a technology company that serves thousands of elderly Americans, and a woman who learned the hardest way possible that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can sometimes be the ones who betray you most completely. But 12 years ago, I was just a 17-year-old girl standing in her parents' living room watching her entire world collapse without even knowing it. The Torres family Christmas party was never really about celebrating the holiday. It was a performance, an annual ritual where my parents displayed their children like trophies to be admired by relatives, neighbors, and fellow church members. Every year they would gather everyone in our living room, serve my mother's famous eggnog, and proceed to announce whatever accomplishments they deemed worthy of public recognition. I had learned by the age of 10 that my accomplishments rarely made the list. That Christmas Eve, the house was packed tighter than usual. Aunts and uncles I only saw once a year crowded the couch and dining chairs. Neighbors from up and down the street balanced paper plates of cookies while making small talk. The church choir director stood near the fireplace with her husband, both of them beaming as if they were guests at a royal wedding rather than a suburban holiday party. I stood near the back of the room, close to the hallway where I could disappear if necessary. My twin sister Savannah occupied the center of attention as she always did, her blonde hair perfectly curled, her red dress catching the light from the Christmas tree. We were identical in features, but somehow she had always seemed shinier than me, more polished, more worthy of the spotlight our parents constantly directed at her. My father clinked his glass with a fork, and the room fell silent. He loved these moments, loved the feeling of commanding an audience. He was a man who believed his family's image was his greatest achievement, and he curated that image with the dedication of a museum director. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, his voice carrying that practiced warmth he reserved for public occasions. "Before we continue with the festivities, I have a very special announcement to make." He paused for dramatic effect, and my stomach tightened. I knew what was coming. I had applied to Harvard too, had poured my heart into that application, had dreamed of seeing my own name on an acceptance letter. But I had heard nothing. Not an acceptance, not a rejection, not even a waitlist notification. Just silence. "I am proud to announce," my father continued, his chest swelling visibly, "that our daughter Savannah has been accepted to Harvard University with a full academic scholarship valued at $120,000. The room erupted. Applause thundered through the living room. Relatives rushed forward to embrace Savannah, their voices overlapping with congratulations and exclamations of pride. The church choir director actually wiped tears from her eyes. My father stood beside Savannah, his hand on her shoulder, looking like a man who had just won the lottery. I clapped too. What else could I do? My hands came together mechanically while my face held a smile that felt like it might crack my skin. I watched my sister accept hug after hug, watched my father shake hands with neighbors, who told him what a wonderful job he had done, raising such an exceptional daughter. No one looked at me. No one asked about my applications. No one seemed to remember that I had graduated at the top of my class, that I had captained the debate team to state championships, that I had spent 200 hours volunteering at the local nursing home. On the mantel above the fireplace, I noticed the framed photographs displayed for guests to admire. Savannah's debate trophies, Savannah's honor roll certificates, Savannah's Community Service Award. My accomplishments, equally numerous, were nowhere to be seen. My mother appeared beside me so quietly I almost jumped. She was holding a glass of wine, her expression unreadable as she watched the celebration continuing around Savannah. "Your sister is the pride of this family," she said, not bothering to look at me. "Unlike you." The words hit me like a slap, though I should have been used to them by now. I had spent 17 years hearing variations of the same message. Savannah was special. Savannah was destined for greatness. And Shelby was the other one, the spare. The daughter who existed in the margins of family photographs and parental attention. I excused myself and retreated to the kitchen, desperate for a moment alone. Through the window I could see Mrs. Carter, our elderly neighbor, making her way toward the back door. She had attended these Christmas parties for as long as I could remember, always bringing her famous peanut butter cookies, always watching the family dynamics with knowing eyes. She found me standing at the sink, gripping the counter with both hands, fighting to keep my composure. "Shelby, dear." Her voice was gentle, weathered by 8 decades of life. She took my hand in both of hers, her skin papery but warm. "I see you. I have always seen you." I wanted to respond, but my throat had closed around the words. Mrs. Carter squeezed my hand once more before returning to the party, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Savannah had retreated to her room to call friends with her exciting news, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Something nagged at me, a detail I could not quite place. I had applied to Harvard. I had submitted everything correctly, met every deadline, written essays I was genuinely proud of. Yet I had received no response at all. I thought about my mother's strange behavior during decision season, the way she had started checking the mailbox every afternoon before anyone else got home. I thought about the nervous glance she had exchanged with my father when I mentioned I was still waiting to hear from colleges. I thought about how quickly they had accepted my supposed rejection without question or comfort. The envelope that should have changed my life had vanished, and I was about to discover it never disappeared at all. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in my childhood bed staring at the same ceiling I had stared at for 17 years, listening to the distant sounds of my parents cleaning up from the party. Their muffled voices carried through the walls, though I could not make out the words. Occasionally I heard my mother's laughter, bright and satisfied, the sound of a woman whose evening had gone exactly as planned. My mind kept returning to the same question, circling it like a moth around a flame. How was it possible that I had received no response from Harvard? Not an acceptance, not a rejection, not even a form letter acknowledging my application. Every other school had responded. I had acceptances from 3 state universities and 1 private college with a partial scholarship. But from Harvard, the school I had dreamed about since freshman year, there had been only silence. I forced myself to think back to those months before college decisions arrived, back to the spring of my senior year, when everything had seemed possible. I had been the top student in my class, locked in a close race for valedictorian with only 2 other students. I had served as captain of the debate team, leading us to the state championships for the first time in our school's history. I had coordinated volunteer programs at 3 different organizations, logging more community service hours than any other student in my graduating class. My teachers had looked at my transcript and my test scores and told me repeatedly that I was exactly what elite universities were looking for. "Your Harvard material shall be," Mrs. Patterson, my English teacher, had said with genuine conviction. "Don't sell yourself short. You belong there." I had believed her. I had poured everything into my application, writing and rewriting my personal essay until every word felt perfect. I had requested recommendation letters months in advance, giving my teachers plenty of time to craft thoughtful endorsements. I had submitted everything before the deadline, triple-checking each component to ensure nothing was missing. Then came the waiting. March arrived, and with it came the season of thick envelopes and thin envelopes of dreams fulfilled and dreams deferred. I checked the mailbox every day after school, my heart racing each time I saw the stack of letters waiting inside. Acceptances arrived from other schools, each one bringing a moment of relief, followed immediately by the question, "But what about Harvard?" The days turned into weeks. My classmates began announcing their decisions, committing to universities, buying sweatshirts emblazoned with their future alma maters. And still, nothing came from Cambridge. I started checking the mailbox twice a day, then 3 times. I created an account on the Harvard admissions portal and refreshed it obsessively, but my status never changed from application under review. I remember asking my mother about it once, wondering aloud if perhaps my application had been lost in the mail. She had been standing at the kitchen sink, her back to me, and I noticed her shoulders stiffen at the question. "I'm sure they just haven't decided yet," she said without turning around. "Some schools take longer than others." But her voice had carried an edge I could not quite identify, and she had changed the subject, quickly asking about my plans for the weekend. Now, lying in bed 12 years later, another memory surfaced with startling clarity. It was an afternoon in late March, perhaps a week before the Christmas party that had just concluded. I had come home early from school because debate practice had been canceled. The house had been quiet when I entered, and I had assumed no one was home until I heard the rustle of paper from the kitchen. My mother stood at the counter with several envelopes spread before her. She was so absorbed in what she was doing that she did not hear me approach. I remember noticing that one of the envelopes looked strange, its flap wrinkled and slightly torn, the adhesive strip discolored, as if it had been steamed open and resealed. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind of expensive stationery that important institutions used for important correspondence. "What's that?" I had asked, startling her so badly she nearly knocked her coffee cup to the floor. She spun around, her face flushed, her hands moving quickly to gather the envelopes into a pile. "Just junk mail." She snapped, her tone sharper than the question warranted. "Advertisements and credit card offers, nothing important." She had shoved everything into her purse before I could see anything else, then brushed past me with a muttered comment about needing to start dinner. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. Mothers dealt with household mail. It was not unusual for her to sort through advertisements and discard what the family did not need. But now that memory took on a different shape. The expensive paper, the tampered envelope, the guilty flush on her face, the way she had refused to meet my eyes as she hurried from the room. I thought about my father's response when I finally asked him directly whether Harvard had rejected me. He had been reading the newspaper in his armchair, and he did not look up when he answered. "Harvard never contacted you," he said, turning a page. "I guess you weren't what they were looking for." His voice had wavered slightly on the last few words, and I remembered thinking it was strange that he still would not meet my eyes. But I was 17 years old, and I trusted my parents completely. If they said Harvard had not wanted me, then Harvard had not wanted me. I internalized that rejection as proof of my own inadequacy. I spent the following months convincing myself that my teachers had been wrong, that I had overestimated my abilities, that I was simply not as special as I had allowed myself to believe. I carried that belief for years. It shaped the way I saw myself, the way I approached challenges, the way I accepted my place in the family hierarchy. Savannah was the exceptional one. I was ordinary. That was simply the truth of our family, as fixed and immutable as the laws of physics. But lying awake after that Christmas party, watching shadows move across my ceiling, I felt something shifting inside me. The pieces were not fitting together the way they should. My mother's nervous behavior around the mailbox, The strange envelope with its tampered seal. My father's inability to look at me when he delivered the news of my supposed rejection. The complete absence of any communication from Harvard, not even the standard rejection letter that every declined applicant received. Someone in my own family had rewritten my future, and I was only beginning to see the ink. Those suspicions I harbored after the Christmas party did not disappear, but they faded into the background as the demands of daily survival took over. I did not have the luxury of investigating my family's secrets when I was too busy trying to build a life from the wreckage of my diminished expectations. The questions remained buried somewhere in the back of my mind, waiting for a time when I would have the strength and resources to pursue them. That time would not come for many years. In the fall following that fateful Christmas, I enrolled at Westfield State College, a small institution tucked away in a forgotten corner of the country where ambition went to die. The campus consisted of a handful of aging brick buildings connected by cracked sidewalks and surrounded by parking lots that seemed perpetually half empty. The library was understocked and smelled of mildew. The dormitories had been built in the 1960s and had not been significantly updated since. The entire place carried an air of resigned mediocrity, as if the institution itself had accepted its place at the bottom of the academic hierarchy. I remember sitting at my first lecture hall surrounded by students who scrolled through their phones while the professor droned through a syllabus. The desks were scarred with decades of carved initials and peeling laminate. The projector flickered constantly, casting a sickly yellow light across presentations that appeared to have been created in the previous century. The professor himself seemed defeated, a man who had once dreamed of tenure at a research university and had instead landed here teaching introductory courses to students who could not wait to leave. I thought about the Harvard brochures I had studied so carefully during my senior year of high school. The gleaming libraries filled with leather-bound volumes. The historic lecture halls where Nobel laureates shared their wisdom. The manicured courtyards where brilliant minds gathered to discuss ideas that would shape the future. The contrast with my current reality was so stark that it sometimes took my breath away. But I refused to let my environment determine my trajectory. While other students slumped in the back rows and did the minimum required to pass, I sat in the front of every classroom. I asked questions that sometimes annoyed my professors, who were unaccustomed to students displaying genuine curiosity. I completed every reading assignment, took meticulous notes, and sought out the few faculty members who still cared about teaching. If I could not have Harvard's resources, I would extract every possible drop of value from the resources I did have. The greater challenge was financial. My parents had made clear that they would not contribute to my education, having apparently exhausted their generosity on Savannah's Harvard experience. I was on my own, which meant I needed to work constantly just to survive. My alarm went off at 4:30 every morning. By 5 o'clock, I was pushing a cleaning cart through the dormitory hallways, scrubbing toilets and mopping floors while my fellow students slept. The work was degrading in ways I had not anticipated. I learned to keep my head down when I recognized classmates stumbling back from parties too drunk to notice the girl cleaning up after them. I learned to ignore the occasional cruel comment from students who saw me as part of the furniture, invisible and insignificant. After my morning classes, I rushed to the Bluebird Diner on the edge of campus, where I waitressed through the lunch rush. The tips were inconsistent, and the customers often demanding, but the owner let me eat whatever the kitchen was about to throw out, which saved me precious dollars. I became an expert at making a single meal stretch across an entire day, supplementing diner leftovers with instant noodles purchased in bulk from the discount grocery store. Evenings belonged to Hartley Insurance, a local company that hired college students for data entry at minimum wage. I sat in a fluorescent-lit cubicle from 6 until 10 every night, typing numbers into spreadsheets, until my vision blurred and my fingers cramped. By the time I returned to my dormitory, I had just enough energy to review my notes for the next day's classes before collapsing into a sleep so deep it felt like death. Textbooks were luxuries I could rarely afford. I spent hours at the library photocopier carefully reproducing chapters from books I could not buy. I befriended the circulation desk staff who sometimes let me keep reserve materials an extra day when I needed more time. I learned to recognize which professors were sympathetic to financial hardship and which viewed poverty as a character flaw. I learned to be invisible when necessary and indispensable when possible. The exhaustion was relentless. There were nights when I fell asleep at my desk in the insurance office only to be jolted awake by a supervisor's sharp knock. There were mornings when my hands shook so badly from fatigue that I could barely grip the mop handle. There were moments when I wondered whether any of it was worth the struggle, whether I should simply accept my place in the world and stop fighting against gravity. But each hardship taught me something valuable. I learned discipline that no classroom could provide. I learned resilience that could not be graded or certified. I learned that I could survive anything, endure anything, overcome anything, without help from anyone. These lessons would prove more valuable than any Harvard degree. Phone calls home were exercises in emotional endurance. I would call on Sunday evenings when rates were lowest, hoping to maintain some connection to my family. But the conversations followed a predictable pattern that left me feeling emptier each time. "Savannah's professors are so impressed with her work," my mother would say. "She's been invited to 3 different faculty dinners this semester." "Your sister's internship at the consulting firm is going wonderfully," my father would add. "They've already mentioned the possibility of a full-time offer after graduation." They never asked about my classes. They never inquired about my grades or my professors or whether I was learning anything meaningful. They never wondered how I was paying for food or whether I had enough warm clothes for winter. The silence around my existence was so complete that sometimes I wondered if they remembered I existed at all. At first, these calls devastated me. I would hang up the phone and sit in the dormitory hallway fighting back tears, wondering what I had done to deserve such complete invisibility in my own family. But gradually the pain transformed into something else. An armor began forming around my heart. I started to understand that love in my family was not distributed equally, that it was conditional and scarce and reserved for the daughter who reflected well on my parents' ambitions. This realization hurt more than I can describe, but it also set me free. I stopped seeking approval that would never come. I stopped hoping for recognition that would never arrive. I stopped waiting for my parents to see me. I was building myself from nothing, while Savannah's perfect life was already beginning to crack. The armor I was building around my heart protected me from my family's indifference, but it also threatened to isolate me from everyone else. I moved through my days like a ghost, efficient and invisible, focused entirely on survival. I had stopped expecting anyone to notice me, stopped hoping for recognition or connection. Then, in the spring semester of my sophomore year, I walked into a classroom that would change the trajectory of my entire life. Business Fundamentals was a required course that most students treated as an obstacle to be endured. The class met in a basement lecture hall with poor lighting and uncomfortable seats, taught by a professor most of my peers dismissed as hopelessly outdated. Professor Harold Blackwood was in his early 70s, a tall man with silver hair and sharp eyes who wore the same style of navy suit every day. He spoke slowly and methodically, often pausing mid-sentence to stare out the window as if lost in memory. The students around me scrolled through their phones or dozed off, counting the minutes until they could escape. But I was captivated from the first lecture. Where others heard dry theory, I heard the voice of experience. Professor Blackwood had spent 40 years on Wall Street before retiring to care for his wife during her battle with cancer. After she passed, he had taken up teaching as a way to fill the emptiness, sharing the knowledge he had accumulated over decades of navigating financial markets. His examples came not from textbooks, but from deals he had personally negotiated, crises he had survived, fortunes he had watched rise and fall. I sat in the front row and took notes on everything. I noticed details that escaped my classmates, the subtle emphasis he placed on certain concepts, the warnings hidden within his anecdotes, the principles that seemed to guide his understanding of how the world really worked. For the first time since arriving at this mediocre institution, I felt like I was learning something that mattered. One afternoon, after the other students had filed out, I approached his desk with a question that had been forming in my mind for weeks. Professor Blackwood, you mentioned that markets are theoretically efficient, but you also described several situations where you exploited significant inefficiencies. How do you reconcile those ideas? He looked up at me, and something shifted in his expression. For a long moment, he simply studied my face as if seeing me for the first time. Then a slow smile spread across his weathered features. "You're the first student in 3 years to ask a question that matters," he said. "What's your name?" That single moment of recognition unlocked something inside me that I had kept carefully buried. Someone saw me. Someone noticed that I was more than the invisible girl scrubbing toilets and serving coffee and typing data into spreadsheets. Someone recognized that behind my exhausted exterior lived a mind that was hungry for knowledge and capable of insights that my circumstances had not yet managed to crush. Professor Blackwood invited me to continue the conversation at a coffee shop near campus. That first meeting stretched into 2 hours, and by the end we had established what would become a weekly ritual. Every Thursday afternoon, I would meet him at the corner booth of the Daily Grind, and we would talk about business concepts, market trends, economic philosophy, and the nature of success. He was the first person who treated my analytical abilities as assets rather than inconveniences. When I made observations about patterns I noticed in the news, he would lean forward with genuine interest and ask probing follow-up questions. When I proposed theories about why certain businesses succeeded while others failed, he would test my reasoning with the rigor of a man who had bet millions on similar analyses. He pushed me to think bigger, to question assumptions, to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. During one of our conversations, I found myself describing my family situation in more detail than I had intended. I told him about the favoritism, the invisibility, the constant comparisons to a sister who seemed destined for greatness, while I was expected to accept mediocrity. I had not planned to share any of this, but something about his steady presence made honesty feel safe. He listened without interrupting his coffee growing cold in his hands. When I finished, he did not offer pity or platitudes. Instead, he fixed me with those sharp eyes and said something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The people who climb highest are often the ones who started in the deepest valleys. Your family's dismissal is not a verdict on your worth. It's a crucible. And crucibles either destroy you or transform you into something stronger than you ever imagined. He shared stories of entrepreneurs and executives he had known who came from backgrounds of poverty, abuse, and neglect. Men and women who had built empires from nothing, who had channeled their hunger and their pain into fuel for extraordinary achievement. He helped me see my circumstances not as limitations, but as preparation for something greater. One Thursday, our conversation turned to emerging markets and underserved demographics. Professor Blackwood set down his coffee cup and fixed me with a knowing look. "Everyone in technology is obsessed with building apps for teenagers," he said. "Social media games, endless entertainment. But who's solving problems for the people who actually have money and need help? The elderly population is growing faster than any other demographic. They have resources, they have needs, and almost nobody is paying attention to them." The observation planted itself in my mind like a seed falling into fertile soil. Over the following weeks, I began observing elderly people in my community with new eyes. I noticed how they struggled with smartphones designed for younger hands and sharper eyes. I saw the isolation of seniors who could not navigate video calling technology to connect with distant grandchildren. I recognized the unmet needs for medication reminders, emergency assistance, simplified communication tools. A vision began forming in the back of my mind, hazy at first, but growing clearer with each passing day. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to dream about building something meaningful. Not just surviving, not just enduring, but creating something that could change my circumstances while genuinely helping others. The idea was still formless, years away from realization, but it had taken root. And Professor Blackwood had been the one to plant it. He gave me something my parents never did, the belief that I was capable of greatness. Professor Blackwood's belief in me became the foundation upon which I rebuilt my sense of self-worth. I graduated from Westfield State with honors, a distinction that meant little on paper, but represented everything I had overcome. As I walked across that modest stage to receive my diploma, I carried with me the lessons of 4 years spent in the trenches of survival and the vision that had been planted in my mind during those Thursday afternoon conversations. The seed of my future was still dormant, waiting for the right conditions to grow. First, I needed to learn how the business world actually worked. I landed an entry-level position at Nexus Software Solutions, a small company specializing in business management systems for mid-sized corporations. The salary was modest, and the role was unimpressive, but it was a foot in the door of an industry I knew nothing about. I arrived on my first day wearing a second-hand blazer and carrying a leather portfolio I had found at a thrift store, determined to project a confidence I did not entirely feel. The office occupied 3 floors of a downtown building, with the executive suites on the top floor, and the technical teams spread across the middle. I was escorted to the basement, where a cramped desk awaited me in a windowless room that also housed the server equipment. The HR manager explained that space was limited upstairs and that I would be relocated once something opened up. Her tone suggested this was unlikely to happen anytime soon. I was arranging my few belongings on the desk when I heard voices from the hallway. 2 young men stood near the elevator, both wearing the kind of expensive casual clothing that signaled elite education and family money. I recognized them from the orientation session that morning. Recent graduates from prestigious business programs who had been welcomed with corner desks and introductions to senior leadership. "Did you see where they put the girl from Westfield State?" one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. "The basement, with the servers." The other laughed. "I give her 3 months, maybe less. These no-name diploma types never last. They don't have the foundation." They walked away without noticing me standing just inside the doorway, my face burning with humiliation. The familiar feeling washed over me, the sensation of being dismissed before I had even been given a chance to prove myself. For a moment, I felt like that invisible girl at the Christmas party again, watching from the corner while everyone celebrated someone else. But I had changed since that night. The years of struggle had transformed my vulnerability into something harder, something more useful. I took the humiliation and channeled it into fuel, the same way I had channeled my family's rejection into determination during college. These men had placed a bet against me. I intended to make them lose. From that day forward, I arrived at the office before anyone else and left after everyone had gone home. I studied the company's systems with the obsessive attention I had once devoted to photocopied textbooks. I asked questions that annoyed my colleagues and took notes that filled entire notebooks. The basement became my laboratory, and I was determined to emerge from it with knowledge that no one else possessed. The tasks I was assigned reflected my status at the bottom of the hierarchy. Legacy code that no one wanted to touch. Forgotten bugs in systems that clients had complained about for years. Customer service calls from the most difficult and demanding accounts, the ones that made experienced employees pretend to be away from their desks. My colleagues viewed these assignments as punishment, the unglamorous work that marked me as expendable. I saw something different. Each piece of legacy code taught me how the company's systems had evolved over time, revealing patterns and shortcuts that current developers had never learned. Each bug I fixed deepened my understanding of how the software actually functioned, not how it was supposed to function according to the documentation. Each angry customer became an opportunity to understand what the company was doing wrong and how it might be done better. I began mapping the inefficiencies I discovered, creating detailed documentation of problems that senior employees had accepted as unavoidable. I built relationships with the frustrated clients I was assigned to placate, learning their needs and earning their trust through responsiveness and genuine care. Slowly, imperceptibly, I became the person everyone turned to when something went wrong. The knowledge I accumulated became my secret weapon, a comprehensive understanding of the company that no one else had bothered to develop. My direct supervisor was a pragmatic woman named Jennifer Chen, who had risen through the ranks over 15 years of steady competence. She was not warm, but she was fair, and she noticed things that other managers overlooked. I caught her watching me, sometimes observing how I handled difficult calls or stayed late to solve problems that were technically not my responsibility. She never commented, but I sensed she was taking mental notes. The test came 6 months after I started. One of the company's largest clients, a regional hospital network, threatened to cancel their contract due to repeated technical failures. The account was worth over $2 million annually, and its loss would trigger layoffs. Senior developers had failed to resolve the issues, and the client was demanding a complete system overhaul within 3 weeks, or they would walk. Jennifer called me into her office and closed the door. "I'm putting you on the rescue team for the Meridian Health account," she said, her expression unreadable. "You'll be the lead technical coordinator." I understood immediately what she was doing. If we failed, I would be blamed as the newcomer who had been given too much responsibility too soon. If we succeeded, I would prove that I belonged upstairs with the rest of the team. It was a gamble for both of us, and Jennifer was placing her chips on a basement employee with a no-name diploma. "I won't let you down," I told her. What followed were the most intense 2 weeks of my professional life. I worked 20-hour days surviving on coffee from the break room and snacks from the vending machine. I slept on the floor beneath my desk when exhaustion became impossible to ignore. I coordinated between developers who resented taking direction from someone they considered beneath them. I communicated with the client's IT team, translating their frustrations into actionable tasks. I applied everything I had learned during my months in the basement, every piece of institutional knowledge I had accumulated while fixing the problems no one else wanted to touch. They gave me the impossible project to watch me fail. They had no idea what I was capable of. The Meridian Health project was worse than anyone had described. When I finally gained access to the full documentation, I discovered a disaster that had been building for months before anyone acknowledged its severity. The system was 3 months behind schedule, riddled with bugs that cascaded into new problems every time developers attempted fixes, and the client had lost all faith in our ability to deliver. Previous team leads had thrown up their hands and declared the situation unsalvageable. The general consensus was that the contract was already lost and we were simply going through the motions. I refused to accept that verdict. I spent the first 3 days doing nothing but analyzing the existing codebase and workflow documentation, mapping every dependency and tracing every failure back to its origin point. What I discovered was not a technical problem, but a structural one. The developers had been working in isolation, making changes without coordinating with each other, creating conflicts that multiplied with every attempted fix. The communication between our team and the client's IT department had broken down so completely that we were solving problems they no longer cared about while ignoring issues that were causing them daily pain. I redesigned the entire workflow from scratch. I implemented daily coordination meetings that forced developers to share their progress and identify potential conflicts before they became crises. I established a direct communication channel with the client's lead administrator, checking in every evening to ensure our priorities aligned with their actual needs. I created documentation systems that tracked every change and made it impossible for fixes in one area to create problems in another. The work consumed me completely. I stopped going home sleeping instead on a cot I set up in the server room. I survived on coffee and whatever I could purchase from the vending machines down the hall. My eyes burned from staring at screens and my hands sometimes shook from exhaustion, but I refused to slow down. I caught errors that more experienced engineers had missed, problems buried so deep in the legacy code that no one had thought to look for them. Each night bled into the next morning, and the days lost their individual identity, becoming one continuous push toward a deadline that everyone else had written off as impossible. On the final day before the client's ultimatum expired, I submitted the completed system for testing. I sat at my desk in the basement, too exhausted to feel nervous, watching as the quality assurance team ran through their verification protocols. The results came back clean. Every function worked as intended. Every bug had been eliminated. The system not only met the original specifications, but exceeded them, incorporating improvements I had developed during my weeks of intensive analysis. The client's response arrived the following morning. Their project manager called Jennifer directly, and I could hear her voice rising with surprise through the office walls. When she emerged from her office, she walked straight to my desk in the basement and stood there for a moment, looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. "They're not canceling the contract," she said. "They're expanding it. 3 new projects over 3 years. $5 million in additional revenue." She paused, and something that might have been admiration crossed her face. "You just saved this company, Shelby." Word spread through the office like wildfire. The girl from the basement saved us. Senior executives who had never acknowledged my existence suddenly requested meetings to hear about my approach. Department heads who had walked past my desk without a glance now stopped to ask my opinion on their projects. The 2 young men who had bet I would not last 3 months avoided eye contact when we passed in the hallways. My promotions came rapidly. Within 6 months, I had been elevated twice, moving from the basement to a corner desk on the main floor with a window that overlooked the city. My salary increased substantially, and I was assigned to lead a small team of my own. The colleagues who had mocked my diploma now came to me for advice, treating me with the deference reserved for those who have proven themselves beyond question. I accepted their newfound respect gracefully, never mentioning what I had overheard on my first day. But I never forgot it either. I never forgot how quickly respect could vanish and how easily it could be withheld from those who lacked the right credentials. The meeting that would change everything came 3 months after my second promotion. A senior investor named William Chen, whose venture capital firm held a significant stake in the company, requested a private lunch. He had heard about what he called the Meridian Miracle, and wanted to understand how a junior employee from an unknown college had accomplished what experienced professionals could not. We met at an upscale restaurant near the office, the kind of establishment I had only seen from the outside during my years of working multiple jobs. Over plates of food that cost more than I once spent on groceries in a month, William asked probing questions about my methodology and my vision. He seemed less interested in the technical details than in understanding how I thought about problems. "What are your long-term ambitions?" he asked, eventually setting down his fork. "You're clearly not going to stay in middle management forever. What do you want to build?" The question caught me off guard, but my answer emerged without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. I told him about the idea that had been germinating in my mind since my conversations with Professor Blackwood. Technology designed specifically for elderly users, simplified interfaces that acknowledged declining vision and motor control, systems that addressed isolation medication management, emergency response, and connection with family members. A market that everyone in technology seemed determined to ignore. William leaned forward in his chair, his expression sharpening with genuine interest. "That's $1 billion market that everyone's overlooking," he said. "The elderly population is growing faster than any other demographic. They have money, they have needs, and nobody is building solutions for them." He pulled a business card from his wallet and slid it across the table. "When you're ready to build this, call me. I want to be your first investor." I left that lunch with William's card in my pocket and a new sense of possibility expanding in my chest. For the first time, I could see a clear path from where I stood to the future I wanted to create. The seed Professor Blackwood had planted was ready to grow. My name was finally being spoken in rooms I had never entered, but the family who ignored me was about to come calling. The call from my mother came on a Tuesday evening, catching me off guard as I worked late at the office reviewing proposals for a new client engagement. Her voice carried that particular tone she reserved for occasions when she needed something, a warmth that felt manufactured after years of coldness. Thanksgiving was approaching, she explained, and it had been so long since the whole family had gathered together. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could come home for the holiday? I agreed, surprising myself with how quickly the word yes left my mouth. Some part of me, despite everything I had learned about my family's conditional love, still harbored a secret hope. I had accomplished things now. I had proven myself in the professional world, earned promotions, saved a major account, attracted the attention of investors. Perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps my achievements might finally earn me a place at the table alongside my sister. The hope began dying the moment I walked through my parents' front door. The living room was filled with familiar faces from the church community, older women who had known our family for decades. My mother stood at the center of the gathering holding court, as she always did, with Savannah positioned beside her like a prized possession on display. And then Savannah received the highest honors in her graduating class, my mother was saying as I entered. Harvard doesn't just hand those out to anyone you know. She worked so hard, and it all paid off beautifully. The conversations paused when I appeared in the doorway. A few of the churchwomen glanced at me with polite smiles before turning their attention back to Savannah. My mother acknowledged my arrival with a brief nod, as if I were a delivery person who had arrived at an inconvenient moment. "Shelby's here," she announced without enthusiasm. "She works at some computer company now." No mention of my promotions. No reference to the millions of dollars I had saved through my work. No invitation to join the circle of admiration that surrounded my sister. I set down my bag and stood awkwardly at the edge of the room, waiting for someone to ask about my life. No one did. The conversations resumed their familiar rhythm, revolving around Savannah's achievements, as if gravity itself bent toward her. I tried later that evening during a quieter moment when the churchwomen had departed and only family remained. We sat around the dining table, and I saw an opening when my father asked generally how everyone's year had been going. "Things have been going really well for me, actually," I said, sitting up straighter. "I was promoted twice in the last 6 months. I led the team that rescued our biggest client account. We saved a contract worth over $2 million, and they've expanded their business with us because of the work I did." My father's hand went up before I finished speaking, a dismissive wave that stopped my words mid-sentence. "That's nice, Shelby. But it's not like you're changing the world. It's just computers." He turned to Savannah with renewed interest. "Now Savannah's being considered for a position at McKinsey. That's a top consulting firm, one of the best in the world. They only take the most exceptional candidates." My mother nodded vigorously. "It's so impressive. Although I'm not surprised. Savannah has always been destined for great things." She glanced at me with what might have been pity. "It's good you found something simple to do with yourself, Shelby. Not everyone is meant for extraordinary achievements." The casual cruelty took my breath away. I had worked myself to the point of collapse. I had slept on floors and survived on vending machine food and proven myself against colleagues who had mocked my education. I had caught the attention of venture capitalists and been told my ideas could be worth billions. And still, to my parents, I was nothing. I would always be nothing. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom, closing the door behind me with careful control. My hands gripped the edge of the sink knuckles, whitening as I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was successful, capable, on the verge of building something meaningful. But in this house, she was still the invisible daughter, the lesser twin, the disappointment that could never measure up to her sister's reflected glory. I refused to let them see me cry. I took deep breaths until the tightness in my chest loosened, then splashed cold water on my face and composed my expression into something neutral. When I emerged, I decided to spend the rest of the visit observing rather than participating. If they wanted to pretend I did not exist, I would use the invisibility to my advantage. What I observed troubled me deeply. Savannah, the golden child, the pride of the family, did not look like someone living a glamorous and successful life. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, visible even beneath carefully applied concealer. She had lost weight since I last saw her. Her cheekbones more prominent, her wrists thinner. The smile she wore throughout the evening never quite reached her eyes, and I noticed how it faltered whenever anyone mentioned Harvard. At one point, an aunt asked Savannah to share a favorite memory from her college years. The question seemed innocent enough, but I watched my sister's hand tremble as she lifted her wine glass. She gave a vague answer about enjoying the libraries and quickly changed the subject. Later, she excused herself to use the restroom and was gone for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, her eyes were red, and she avoided looking at anyone directly. I found a moment to approach her when she was alone in the kitchen refilling her glass. "Savannah, are you okay? You seem different. Is something wrong?" Her reaction was immediate and defensive. She flinched as if I had threatened her, then forced a laugh that sounded hollow. "Everything's fine. Harvard was great. I don't want to talk about it. The words came out rehearsed mechanical, a script she had memorized rather than a genuine response. I pressed gently. You don't seem fine. If something is bothering you, you can tell me. Despite everything, I'm still your sister. Savannah's eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw something flicker in their depths. Fear, pain, guilt. Then the mask slammed back down and she brushed past me with a muttered excuse about needing to help our mother with dessert. I stood alone in the kitchen, my mind turning over what I had witnessed. Savannah had been the golden child, the one who received everything while I received nothing. She had lived the life that should have been mine, walked the paths I had been denied, claimed the achievements I had earned. By every measure that mattered to our parents, she had won. Savannah had been this golden child. So why did she look like she was carrying the weight of a terrible secret? The question lingered in my mind throughout the rest of Thanksgiving weekend, coloring every interaction I had with my sister. I watched her more carefully now, noticing details I had overlooked during years of being too consumed by my own struggles to pay attention. The way she startled at sudden noises, the faraway look that crossed her face during quiet moments, the subtle tension in her shoulders whenever our parents mentioned her Harvard years. Something was deeply wrong with Savannah, and whatever it was, our parents either did not notice or did not care to acknowledge it. On my last night at home, I could not sleep. The guest room where I stayed was at the end of the hallway adjacent to Savannah's childhood bedroom, where she was also staying for the holiday. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind churning through the events of the past few days, when I heard something that made my heart stop. Savannah was crying in her sleep. The sound carried through the thin walls, muffled but unmistakable, the kind of anguished sobbing that comes from deep within the chest. I rose from my bed and moved silently into the hallway, drawn toward her door by a mixture of concern and curiosity I could not ignore. I stood outside her room, my ear close to the wood, and listened as her crying dissolved into fragmented words. "Please," she whimpered, her voice thick with whatever nightmare held her captive. "Don't send me to the dean. I'm sorry. I didn't want to. Please, I'll do anything." My blood turned to ice. The dean. She was dreaming about being sent to the dean's office, speaking in the desperate tone of someone facing serious consequences. Why would Harvard's star student, the pride of our family, be having nightmares about academic discipline? The words suggested fear, guilt, punishment. Nothing about this matched the triumphant narrative our parents had promoted for over a decade. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling slightly. The pieces were not fitting together. The sister who had supposedly graduated with highest honors, who had been celebrated at every family gathering, who had been held up as the standard I could never reach, was having nightmares about the dean's office and crying herself to sleep. Something had happened at Harvard, something terrible enough to haunt her years later, and our parents had either buried it or never known at all. The opportunity to learn more came unexpectedly several days after I had returned to my own apartment. I was grocery shopping at a store near my office when I heard a familiar voice call my name. I turned to find Maria Gonzalez pushing a cart toward me, her face brightening with recognition. Maria had been in my graduating class in high school, a friendly acquaintance who had gone on to attend Harvard the same year as Savannah. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, catching up on years of separate lives in the compressed format of a chance grocery store encounter. Maria had become an attorney, was engaged to be married, had moved back to the area recently. Then the conversation turned to mutual acquaintances, and she mentioned my sister. "I was so sad when Savannah left after sophomore year," Maria said casually, examining a display of oranges. "I always thought she'd be there the whole time. We had some classes together freshman year, and she seemed to be doing well." I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. "Left after sophomore year." I repeated, my voice carefully controlled despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Maria looked at me with mild confusion. "Yeah, she just disappeared one semester. Stopped showing up to classes, wasn't in the dorm anymore. Nobody knew what happened. I assumed it was a family emergency or something." She shrugged. I tried to reach out, but she never responded to any of my messages. Is she doing okay now? I managed to produce some vague response about Savannah being fine, thanked Maria for catching up, and walked to my car in a daze, left after sophomore year. That meant Savannah had only completed 2 years at Harvard, not 4. Our parents had claimed she graduated with honors after a full 4-year experience. They had shown us photographs of her supposed graduation ceremony, had described her senior thesis, had recounted the accolades she had received upon completing her degree. All of it was a lie. The timeline I had believed my entire adult life suddenly had a 2-year hole at its center, a gap that our parents had filled with fabricated achievements and manufactured photographs. But why? What had happened that was so terrible? It required such an elaborate deception. I needed to hear the truth from Savannah herself. The next time I saw her at a cousin's birthday party several weeks later, I waited for a moment when we were alone and approached her with deliberate casualness. "I was thinking about Harvard the other day," I said, watching her face carefully. "What was your junior year like? Who were your favorite professors during that time?" The color drained from Savannah's cheeks so quickly I thought she might faint. Her hands clenched at her sides and I saw a tremor pass through her entire body. "I don't remember much," she said, her voice strained. "It was all kind of a blur." I pressed gently, asking about specific courses she might have taken, dormitories, where she might have lived during her supposed junior year. With each question, her agitation grew more visible. Her breathing quickened and her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape route. "Why are you interrogating me?" she finally snapped, her voice rising enough to draw glances from nearby relatives. "I said I don't want to talk about Harvard. Why can't you just leave it alone?" I held up my hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not interrogating you. I'm just asking about college. It's what sisters do." Savannah's expression crumbled, revealing something raw and frightened beneath her practiced composure. She turned to leave, but paused at the doorway and looked back at me. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, thick with unshed tears. "Some things are better left buried, Shelby. Trust me." Then she was gone, leaving me alone with the growing certainty that everything I thought I knew about my sister's perfect life was a carefully constructed fiction. Savannah's Harvard story had a 2-year hole, and I was beginning to understand that her perfect life had been a carefully constructed lie. The mystery of Savannah's missing years stayed with me, but I could not pursue it further without more information. My sister had made clear she would not discuss Harvard, and my parents remained committed to their fictional narrative. I filed the questions away in the back of my mind, knowing that someday the truth would emerge. In the meantime, I had a dream to build. The seed Professor Blackwood had planted during those Thursday afternoon coffee sessions had grown into something I could no longer ignore. The investor William Chen had validated my vision and promised support when I was ready. The corporate world had taught me everything I needed to know about building products, managing teams, and navigating complex systems. It was time to stop working for someone else's dream and start constructing my own. I resigned from Nexus Software Solutions on a Friday afternoon, giving appropriate notice and leaving on good terms with Jennifer and the colleagues who had come to respect me. The following Monday, I filed paperwork to incorporate Silver Life Technologies. I was 26 years old, operating out of a cramped studio apartment with savings that would last perhaps 6 months if I was extremely careful. The fear was constant, but so was the certainty that I was finally doing what I was meant to do. The first year was brutal. I worked alone for months, coding prototypes during the day and conducting user research in the evenings. I visited nursing homes and senior centers, interviewing elderly residents about their struggles with technology. I watched as arthritic hands fumbled with tiny smartphone buttons designed for younger fingers. I listened to stories of isolation from seniors whose grandchildren had moved away and who could not figure out how to use video calling software. I documented the frustration of people who needed medication reminders but found existing apps impossibly complicated. Every observation became a feature in my product development plan. simplified tablets with larger icons and intuitive interfaces, medication reminder systems that worked without requiring users to navigate complex menus, emergency response devices that connected directly to family members and medical services with a single button press, social connection applications designed specifically for people who had never touched a computer before. I burned through my savings faster than expected, living on rice and beans while pouring every available dollar into development. There were nights when I questioned everything, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake leaving the stability of my corporate job for this uncertain venture. But then I would remember Mrs. Carter squeezing my hand at that Christmas party years ago, the only person who had seen me when everyone else looked through me. I was building technology for people like her, people the industry had forgotten and dismissed. The breakthrough came 18 months after incorporation. Silver Life had grown from a one-woman operation to a small team of 5 dedicated employees working out of a rented office space. We had launched our core product line and were serving over 50,000 elderly customers and their families. Our revenue growth rate had attracted attention from the investment community, and I found myself fielding calls from venture capital firms I had once only read about in business publications. I called William Chen, the investor who had given me his card years earlier, and told me to reach out when I was ready. He remembered me immediately and agreed to meet within the week. The pitch I delivered was the culmination of everything I had learned, every insight I had gathered, every problem I had solved. I spoke not just about market opportunity and revenue projections, but about the real impact we were having on real people's lives. I showed him testimonials from families who had reconnected with elderly parents through our technology, from seniors who had regained a sense of independence and dignity. William committed to leading a $15 million Series A investment round. The funding transformed Silver Life from a promising startup into a rapidly scaling enterprise. We opened offices in 3 states, hired a team of over 60 employees, and expanded our product line to address an ever-growing range of needs. The company became known in the industry as a rare example of genuine social impact combined with strong business performance. The recognition followed quickly. Business magazines profiled me as an entrepreneur to watch, emphasizing the contrast between my modest educational background and my extraordinary achievements. I was invited to speak at conferences about innovation, about serving underserved markets, about building companies that mattered. My net worth grew into the millions, a figure that still seemed unreal to someone who had once photocopied textbook chapters because she could not afford to buy them. Everything I had built came from my own talent, my own determination, and the education I had scraped together at an institution no one had ever heard of. I had received no family support, no inherited connections, no advantage beyond my own willingness to work harder than anyone else. The success was mine alone, earned through years of struggle that had forged me into someone capable of achieving what others thought impossible. The local news picked up my story eventually, as they often do when hometown residents achieve notable success. A reporter from my parents' area contacted me for a feature about local entrepreneurs making a national impact. The article ran with a photograph of me standing in front of Silver Life's headquarters looking confident and accomplished, in a way that bore no resemblance to the invisible girl who had once stood in the corner of her parents' living room. My mother called 3 days after the article appeared. I recognized her number on my phone and let it ring several times before answering, already knowing why she was reaching out after years of minimal contact. "Shelby, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying that manufactured warmth I remembered from the Thanksgiving invitation. "I was just thinking about you. How are you doing? We've been seeing your name in the news lately." I played along, sharing carefully selected details about my company and my life. My mother asked follow-up questions with an interest she had never shown during my years of struggle. She mentioned that she and my father were so proud of me, though pride had never been a word they associated with my name before. The conversation felt hollow and opportunistic, a performance from a woman who had called me a disgrace and told me I was not the pride of the family. I knew my parents well enough to understand they did not call without wanting something. The sudden attention, the manufactured affection, the questions about my business that barely concealed questions about my finances. Whatever they needed, they would reveal it soon enough. I just had to wait. I had built an empire from nothing, and now the family who had stolen everything from me suddenly wanted back into my life. The true reason for my mother's sudden interest revealed itself 2 weeks later. She called again, this time with an edge of desperation beneath her carefully controlled voice, and requested a meeting. Not at the family home, not at a restaurant, but at my office. She said she and my father needed to discuss something important, something that required privacy and professionalism. The formality of the request told me everything I needed to know about its seriousness. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon, appearing in my reception area looking smaller than I remembered. My father wore a suit that had seen better days, the fabric slightly frayed at the cuffs, the fit looser than it should have been. My mother had applied makeup carefully, but it could not fully conceal the shadows under her eyes or the tightness around her mouth. They stood awkwardly among the modern furniture of my company's lobby, surrounded by the visible evidence of my success, looking like visitors from another world. I escorted them to my private office and closed the door. They sat across from my desk, the same desk where I had negotiated million-dollar contracts and made decisions that affected dozens of employees. The power dynamic between us had shifted fundamentally, and we all felt it. My parents, who had spent my entire childhood making me feel small and insignificant, now sat before me with the hunched posture of supplicants. My mother began with the manufactured affection I had come to expect. She told me how proud they were of everything I had accomplished, how they had always known I would do something impressive with my life. The lies fell from her lips with practiced ease, but her heart was not in them. She kept glancing at my father, waiting for him to take over and deliver the real message. "Shelby," my father finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "We need your help. We're in serious trouble." The story emerged in halting fragments. Several years ago, my parents had invested heavily in a real estate venture called Torres Realty Ventures. They had purchased properties they believed would appreciate, rapidly borrowed against their home to fund additional acquisitions, and convinced themselves they were building generational wealth. Instead, the market had turned against them. Properties lost value. Tenants stopped paying rent. Maintenance costs exceeded income. One by one, their investments failed, and the debts accumulated. Now they owed nearly $400,000 to various creditors. The family home, the house where I had grown up, where I had stood invisible at Christmas parties while my sister received all the attention, was facing foreclosure. They had exhausted their savings, maxed out their credit cards, and borrowed from every friend and family member willing to lend. Without immediate help, they would lose everything. "We don't have anywhere else to turn," my mother said, her voice stripped of its usual superiority. "You're our only hope, Shelby. Please." I sat in silence for a long moment, processing the irony of the situation. The parents who had dismissed my achievements, who had told me I was not the pride of the family, who had suggested I was only capable of simple work, were now begging for my money. The daughter they had treated as invisible had become their last resort. "How did you fund the initial investment?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Real estate ventures require significant capital. Where did that money come from?" My mother's expression flickered with something I could not quite identify. "We had savings," she said quickly. "Money we'd accumulated over the years from your father's work and careful budgeting." But my father, less skilled at deception than his wife, spoke without thinking. "Well, we used the money we'd set aside, the education funds we didn't need anymore after—" He trailed off abruptly as my mother's head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing a warning. "After what?" I pressed my pulse, quickening. "What education funds?" "Nothing," my mother interjected firmly. "Your father misspoke. It was just general savings, family money we'd been putting away for years." But the damage was done. My mind was already racing through the implications of my father's words. Education funds they didn't need anymore. I had paid for my own college education entirely, working 3 jobs and taking out loans that I was still repaying. Savannah's Harvard education would have been covered by her scholarship, the $120,000 my father had announced with such pride at that Christmas party. If the scholarship had paid for Savannah's education, there should have been no leftover education funds to invest. Unless the scholarship had never actually gone to Harvard. I thought about what I had learned in recent months. Savannah had left Harvard after her sophomore year, according to Maria. That meant only 2 years of tuition would have been paid, not 4. Where had the remaining scholarship money gone? And more importantly, whose scholarship had it actually been? I asked more questions, probing carefully while my parents grew increasingly uncomfortable. When exactly had they started Torres Realty Ventures? My mother was vague, but my father mentioned it was about 10 years ago, shortly after Savannah finished her education. How much had they initially invested? They hedged, but eventually admitted the starting capital had been around $75,000 a sum, far beyond what their regular income could have produced. The timing aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. My parents had come into significant money around the time of the Harvard decisions, money they claimed was savings but could not adequately explain. They had invested it aggressively in ventures that eventually failed. And now, drowning in the consequences of those failures, they had come to me for rescue. The suspicions that had been smoldering in the back of my mind for years suddenly flared into something larger and more dangerous: the missing Harvard letter, my mother's strange behavior around the mailbox, my father's inability to meet my eyes when he told me I had been rejected, Savannah's nightmares about the dean's office, her departure after only 2 years, her terror whenever Harvard was mentioned. A picture was forming, one so monstrous I almost could not bring myself to see it clearly. But I needed proof. I needed evidence. I needed to know exactly what my parents had done before I decided how to respond to their plea for help. "I'll need to review my finances carefully before I can commit to anything," I told them, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. "This is a significant amount of money, and I have responsibilities to my company and employees. Give me a few weeks to assess what's possible." My parents nodded eagerly, gratitude flooding their faces at this small ray of hope. They thanked me profusely as I escorted them back to the lobby, promising to call soon with good news. They had no idea that my mind was already elsewhere, already planning my next moves. I was going to find out the truth about Harvard. I was going to uncover exactly what had happened to that scholarship, to that acceptance letter, to the future that had been stolen from me. And when I had the proof I needed, I would decide what kind of help my parents truly deserved. They came to me for money, not knowing I was about to discover they had already stolen my fortune once before. The weeks following my parents' visit were consumed by investigation. I could not stop thinking about my father's slip about education funds that should not have existed, about money that had appeared from nowhere and been lost in failed investments. The suspicions that had haunted me for years demanded answers, and I was finally in a position to pursue them. I started by calling Harvard's Office of the Registrar, explaining that I needed copies of my original application materials for professional verification purposes. The woman who answered sounded bored at first, accustomed to routine requests from alumni needing transcripts or enrollment verification. But as she searched her database, her tone shifted to something more puzzled. "This is strange," she said slowly. "Your file shows some inconsistencies. Parts of your record seem to have been modified or marked incomplete years ago. There are notes in the system that don't quite make sense." She paused and I could hear her typing. "I'm going to need to escalate this to our records department. Can you provide some additional verification of your identity?" I spent the next several days navigating bureaucratic procedures, submitting copies of my identification, answering security questions, and signing authorization forms. Each step felt like climbing a mountain, but I refused to give up. Something was hidden in those files, something that would explain the mysteries that had accumulated throughout my life. I could feel the truth waiting for me on the other side of these administrative hurdles. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of phone calls and emails, a thick envelope arrived at my office bearing Harvard's official seal. I stared at it for a long time before finding the courage to open it. My assistant had placed it on my desk with the rest of my mail, having no idea that this particular package might contain the answers to questions I had been asking for over a decade. I waited until the office had emptied for the evening. I needed privacy for whatever I was about to discover. The sun was setting outside my window, casting long shadows across my desk as I broke the seal and reached inside the envelope with trembling hands. The first document I pulled out stopped my heart. It was a letter dated 12 years ago, printed on heavy cream-colored paper with the Harvard University letterhead embossed at the top. The text was formal but warm, the kind of language elite institutions use to welcome their chosen few. My eyes moved across the words, each one landing like a hammer blow to my chest. "Dear Ms. Shelby Torres," the letter began. "On behalf of the Admissions Committee, it is my pleasure to congratulate you on your admission to Harvard University for the upcoming academic year. The committee was deeply impressed by your academic achievements, your leadership experience, and your demonstrated commitment to service. We are further pleased to inform you that you have been awarded a full academic scholarship, valued at $120,000, renewable annually, based on satisfactory academic progress." I read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated my comprehension. I had been accepted. Not Savannah. Me. The scholarship my father had announced at that Christmas party, the one that had launched my sister's supposedly brilliant career, had been mine all along. I had earned it. I had deserved it. And somehow it had been taken from me. My vision blurred with tears as I set the letter aside and reached for the next document in the stack. This one was also from Harvard, also dated 12 years ago, but addressed to a different Torres sister. The letterhead was the same, but the tone was entirely different. "Dear Ms. Savannah Torres," it read, "after careful consideration of your application, the Admissions Committee regrets that we are unable to offer you admission to Harvard University for the upcoming academic year. This decision was reached after thorough review of your academic record and supplementary materials. While your application demonstrated effort, the committee determined that your qualifications did not meet the academic standards required for admission." Savannah had been rejected. The sister who had been celebrated, who had been held up as proof of our family's excellence while I stood invisible in the corner, had not been accepted to Harvard at all. The entire narrative I had been forced to live inside for 12 years had been a fabrication, a lie constructed by my parents and maintained at my expense. But the most devastating document was yet to come. I pulled out a form titled Scholarship Declination and felt my entire world collapse around me. The form was official Harvard paperwork, the kind used to release the university from financial commitments when students chose to decline their admission offers. It bore my name in the applicant field, my address, my date of birth. The form stated that the undersigned student was voluntarily declining admission and the associated scholarship releasing Harvard from any obligation to hold the position or funds. At the bottom of the page was a signature line. Someone had signed my name there, officially ending my Harvard future before it could begin. But the handwriting was not mine. I knew my father's penmanship as intimately as I knew my own. I had studied it on birthday cards that arrived sporadically throughout my childhood, on Christmas notes tucked into modest gifts, on the rare letters he had sent during my years away at college. His writing had a distinctive style, the way he formed his capital letters, the slight backward slant, the particular flourish on certain consonants. The signature on my scholarship declination form matched his handwriting perfectly. My father had forged my signature. He had taken a document that required my consent, my personal authorization, and he had signed it himself. He had officially declined my acceptance to Harvard and my scholarship, all without my knowledge, all while I waited desperately for a letter that would never come because he had already responded on my behalf. I sat alone in my office as the last light faded from the sky, the documents spread before me like evidence at a crime scene. Because that is exactly what they were. Evidence of a crime committed against me by my own parents. They had intercepted my acceptance letter, forged my signature to decline the scholarship, and then announced to the world that Savannah had received what was rightfully mine. They had not merely favored my sister. They had deliberately destroyed my future to maintain their preferred narrative about which daughter was worthy of success. Every year of struggle, every night spent cleaning dormitory bathrooms, every moment of self-doubt, when I wondered why I had not been good enough for Harvard, All of it had been manufactured by the people who were supposed to love and protect me. I thought about the money my father had mentioned, the education funds they no longer needed. I understood now where that money had come from. They had sent Savannah to Harvard using funds that should have covered her tuition, since my scholarship would have paid for my education. When Savannah left after 2 years, the remaining money had been funneled into their failed real estate ventures. They had not just stolen my acceptance. They had stolen my scholarship money, built their investment dreams on my destroyed future, and lost everything they had taken from me. The signature that erased my future was written by my father's own hand, and I had the proof. The documents from Harvard confirmed what had been done to me, but they did not tell the complete story. I needed to understand exactly where my scholarship money had gone, needed to trace every dollar that should have funded my education, but instead vanished into my parents' schemes. The forged signature proved the crime, but the financial records would reveal its full scope. I hired a forensic accountant named Patricia Huang, a methodical woman with decades of experience untangling complex financial deceptions. I explained the situation in broad terms, showing her the Harvard documents and describing my suspicions about the family finances. She listened without visible reaction, the professional detachment of someone who had seen countless variations of human greed and betrayal. "I need bank records, investment documents, anything showing the flow of money during the relevant time period," she said. "Do you have access to your parents' financial information?" I did not, but I had something almost as useful. My parents had come to me seeking financial rescue, and in doing so, they had provided documentation of their current debts and assets. That paperwork included references to accounts and institutions that Patricia could investigate further. She also had legal tools available to subpoena records once we established sufficient grounds for a formal inquiry. The investigation took 3 weeks. Patricia worked with quiet efficiency, pulling threads I would never have known to look for, connecting dots across years and institutions. When she finally called me to her office to present her findings, her expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone about to deliver news that would fundamentally alter my understanding of my own life. "I've traced the financial pattern from 12 years ago," she began, spreading documents across her conference table. "What I found is consistent with your suspicions, but the details are worse than I expected." She walked me through the evidence methodically. Approximately $120,000 had appeared in my parents' primary bank account during the spring of my senior year of high school, the exact period when Harvard decisions would have been finalized. The deposits matched the scholarship amount almost perfectly, arriving in installments consistent with how educational disbursements typically worked. "This money should have gone directly to Harvard for your tuition and expenses," Patricia explained. "Instead, it was routed to your parents' personal account. Based on the documentation, they appear to have represented themselves to Harvard as managing your educational finances." The money had not stayed in that account for long. Patricia traced its dispersal with damning precision. Approximately $45,000 had eventually been sent to Harvard over the following 2 years, covering Savannah's tuition during her actual enrollment. This made sense given what Maria had told me. Savannah had only completed 2 years before leaving, so only 2 years of tuition had been required. "Your sister received a small merit scholarship of her own," Patricia continued, "but it was nowhere near enough to cover full tuition. The balance of her educational costs was paid using funds that originated from your scholarship. That accounted for less than half of the stolen money." I asked about the remaining $75,000, dreading the answer I knew was coming. Patricia pulled out another set of documents. "This is where it gets more troubling. The bulk of those funds went directly into an investment entity called Torres Realty Ventures. The timing is unmistakable. Your parents capitalized their real estate venture using money that should have funded your Harvard education." I stared at the transaction records, watching my stolen future flow into property purchases that had ultimately failed spectacularly. My parents had gambled with my academic achievement, betting on real estate deals that collapsed and left them drowning in the debt that had driven them to my office begging for help. But the financial betrayal extended beyond investments. Patricia showed me additional expenditures that coincided with the influx of my scholarship money. Expensive jewelry purchased from a high-end retailer, thousands of dollars worth of pieces that my mother had worn to church events and social gatherings. A country club membership that had cost several $1,000s annually, providing access to the affluent circles my parents aspired to join. A boat that sat in a marina for 2 summers before being sold at a loss. Extensive home renovations that transformed the modest house of my childhood into something more befitting parents of a Harvard student. Your mother appears to have used a significant portion of the funds to build an image of prosperity, Patricia observed. The purchases all cluster around the same time period and align with the scholarship deposits. The woman who had told me I was not the pride of the family, who had called me a disgrace while celebrating my sister's achievements, had literally funded her social climbing with money stolen from my academic success. Every piece of jewelry she wore to impress her church friends, every afternoon spent at the country club, cultivating her image of refined motherhood, had been purchased with my destroyed future. I left Patricia's office with copies of all her findings and drove directly to the law firm of Morrison and Associates, where I had scheduled a consultation with an attorney specializing in fraud cases. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Morrison, reviewed the documents with growing concern. "You have a strong case here," she said after an hour of careful analysis. "Multiple potential charges. Mail fraud for intercepting and responding to correspondence addressed to you. That's a federal crime, by the way. Forgery for your father's signature on the scholarship declination. Financial fraud for misappropriating funds intended for your education. Depending on how we frame it, there may also be grounds for education benefit theft." I asked about the statute of limitations, worried that too much time had passed for legal action. Diane shook her head. "For fraud, the statute typically begins from the date of discovery, not the date of the crime. You only recently discovered what happened. The clock started when you received those Harvard documents, not when your parents committed the acts 12 years ago. You have legal recourse." She leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "I need to be honest with you about what this process will involve. You're talking about taking your own parents to court. It will be public. It will be emotionally brutal. Every detail of your family's dysfunction will be exposed. Defense attorneys will try to paint you as a vindictive daughter seeking revenge rather than justice. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the Christmas party where I had stood invisible in the corner. I thought about the years of working 3 jobs to pay for an education that should have been handed to me. I thought about every night I had blamed myself for not being good enough, every moment I had internalized rejection that had actually been theft. I thought about my mother's sneer when she called me a disgrace wearing jewelry purchased with my scholarship money. "They took my entire future," I said, my voice steady and cold. "This is just accountability." Diane nodded slowly, recognizing the steel beneath my calm exterior. "Then let's build your case." I walked out of her office with the beginning of a legal strategy and a heart that had hardened into something my parents would not recognize. They had raised me to be invisible, to accept crumbs, while my sister received feasts, to believe I was unworthy of the opportunities I had earned. They had no idea that the daughter they had dismissed had become someone capable of holding them accountable for every crime they had committed. My parents had not just stolen an opportunity, they had built their entire false life on the ashes of my dreams. The evidence I had gathered felt like a weapon in my hands, heavy with the power to destroy the lies my family had built. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately, to watch their faces crumble as they realized their deception had finally been exposed. But my lawyer had counseled patience, suggesting I take time to prepare emotionally for what would inevitably be a devastating encounter. I ignored that advice. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too enormous, and I needed to see their reactions for myself before proceeding with formal legal action. I called my mother and requested a family meeting, explaining that I had important matters to discuss regarding their financial situation. She agreed readily, no doubt assuming I had decided to write them a check. We arranged to meet at the family home the following Sunday afternoon, a time when Savannah would also be present. I wanted all of them there when I revealed what I knew. The drive to my parents' house felt surreal, as if I were traveling not just through space, but through time, returning to the scene of a crime I had only recently understood. I carried a folder containing copies of everything: the Harvard acceptance letter bearing my name, the forged scholarship declination with my father's handwriting, the financial records tracing my stolen money into failed investments and luxury purchases. The originals remained safely locked in my attorney's office. My mother greeted me at the door with the warm smile she had adopted since learning of my wealth. My father stood behind her, looking uncomfortable, while Savannah sat on the living room couch, looking pale and anxious. I declined the offer of coffee and took a seat across from them, the folder resting on my lap like a shield. "Thank you all for meeting with me." I began, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "I have something important to share, and I need you to listen without interrupting." I opened the folder and began laying documents on the coffee table between us. First my Harvard acceptance letter, then the scholarship declination form, then the financial records showing the flow of money from my scholarship into their bank account and onward into Torres Realty Ventures. "I know what you did," I said, looking directly at my mother. "I was accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, $120,000 awarded to me based on my academic achievements. You intercepted the letter, forged my signature to decline the scholarship, and announced to everyone that Savannah had received what was rightfully mine. Then you used my money to fund your investments, your country club membership, your jewelry, your entire lifestyle of pretending to be something you weren't." I paused, waiting for the explosion of denial or the flood of guilty tears. I had imagined this moment so many times, had rehearsed what I would say, and tried to predict how they would respond. Nothing had prepared me for what actually happened. My mother's face did not crumble with guilt. It hardened into something cold and calculating, her eyes narrowing as she examined the documents without touching them. When she looked up at me, there was no remorse in her expression, only contempt. "These are obviously fabricated," she said, her voice dripping with dismissive certainty. "I don't know where you got these papers, but they're clearly fake. You've always been jealous of your sister ever since you were children. Now you're creating elaborate conspiracy theories to explain your own failures." The words hit me like ice water. I had expected many things, but not this absolute denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. "These documents came directly from Harvard's records office," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "The financial records were compiled by a forensic accountant. The handwriting on the declination form has been analyzed by experts. This is not fabrication. This is truth." My mother waved her hand dismissively. "Harvard makes mistakes. Accountants can be hired to say anything. You have no real proof, Shelby. Any decent lawyer will tell you this is just bitter speculation from a jealous sibling who couldn't accept that her sister was more successful." I turned to my father, searching his face for any sign of the guilt I knew he must feel. He had signed the form. His handwriting was on the document that had destroyed my future. But he sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear, who wished he could be anywhere other than in this room facing the consequences of his actions. But he said nothing. He did not contradict his wife. He did not apologize. He simply sat in cowardly silence while she defended the indefensible. Savannah had gone pale during my presentation, her hands trembling visibly. When I finished speaking, she mumbled something about needing fresh air and fled the room without looking at anyone. The back door slammed behind her, leaving me alone with my parents and the documents that should have changed everything, but seemed to have changed nothing. My mother leaned forward, her voice dropping to something between a whisper and a hiss. "You have built yourself a nice little business, Shelby. Made something of yourself despite your limitations. That's admirable, I suppose. But don't think for a moment that these ridiculous accusations will get you anywhere. You'll only embarrass yourself and destroy whatever reputation you've managed to build." She smiled, and the expression was terrifying in its confidence. "Go ahead and take this to court if you want. See what happens when you try to tear apart your own family based on forged documents and jealous fantasies. Lawyers are expensive. Trials take years. And in the end, everyone will see you for what you really are, a bitter, envious woman who couldn't stand that her sister received what she felt entitled to." I stood gathering the documents back into my folder with hands that trembled slightly, despite my efforts to control them. I had come here expecting my evidence to shatter their defenses, to force them into confession or at least acknowledgement. Instead, I had encountered a wall of denial so complete that it seemed to exist in a different reality than the one documented in my folder. As I walked toward the door, my mother called after me. "Be careful, Shelby. Families have ways of protecting themselves." The threat hung in the air, barely disguised beneath a veneer of maternal concern. She was warning me that she would fight, that she would use every weapon at her disposal to maintain the lie she had constructed and defended for 12 years. I paused at the door and looked back at her. Something had shifted inside me during this conversation, something fundamental and irreversible. The part of me that had hoped for acknowledgement, for apology, for anything resembling parental love had finally died. In its place grew something harder and more focused. "Thank you for your honesty," I said quietly. "Now I know exactly what I'm dealing with." I walked out of my childhood home and did not look back. My mother believed she had won this encounter, believed her denials had neutralized my accusations and protected her carefully constructed world. She had no idea what she had actually accomplished. Direct confrontation would not work. My mother was too skilled at manipulation, too committed to her lies, too confident in her ability to reframe any evidence as jealousy or fabrication. If I wanted justice, I would need to approach this strategically. I would need witnesses she could not dismiss. I would need expert verification she could not deny. I would need to build a case so overwhelming that no amount of manipulation could survive it. She thought she had won. She had no idea that her denial had just transformed my hurt into a strategy. The drive home from my parents' house gave me time to think. My mother's confident denial had revealed something important about the battle I was facing. She believed her version of events was unassailable because she controlled the family narrative. She had spent decades shaping how everyone perceived our family, presenting herself as a devoted mother, while systematically destroying one daughter to elevate the other. To defeat her, I needed voices from outside that controlled narrative. I needed witnesses who had seen the truth and could no longer be silenced. My thoughts turned to Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor who had squeezed my hand at that Christmas party and whispered that she saw me. She had lived next door to my parents for over 30 years, had watched my sister and me grow up, had attended countless family gatherings and church events. If anyone outside the family had noticed something wrong, it would be her. And unlike my parents, Mrs. Carter had always treated me with genuine kindness. I called her the following morning asking if I might visit for tea. Her voice on the phone carried the same warmth I remembered from my childhood, and she readily agreed. I drove to my parents' neighborhood that afternoon, parking on the street to avoid being seen from their windows, and walked up the familiar path to Mrs. Carter's modest home. She welcomed me at the door with a hug that felt like comfort itself. At 82 years old, she had grown more frail since I last saw her, her white hair thinner and her movements slower, but her eyes remained sharp and kind. She led me to her kitchen, a room filled with decades of accumulated memories, photographs of grandchildren covering the refrigerator, ceramic figurines lining the windowsill, the faint smell of lavender and baked goods that I associated with every visit to this house. We sat at her small kitchen table, cups of tea steaming between us, and made small talk about her health, her grandchildren, the changes in the neighborhood. But I could tell she sensed something serious beneath my casual conversation. Finally, I set down my teacup and met her eyes. "Mrs. Carter, I need to tell you something, and then I need to ask if you know anything that might help me." I shared the story as concisely as I could, the Harvard documents I had obtained, the acceptance letter bearing my name, the forged signature declining my scholarship, the financial records showing how my parents had stolen my money and used it for their own purposes. I watched her face as I spoke, watching emotions flicker across her weathered features. Surprise, then recognition, then something that looked like pain. When I finished, Mrs. Carter's hands were trembling so badly that her teacup rattled against its saucer. She set it down carefully and looked at me with eyes that had filled with tears. "I've been carrying this weight for 12 years, child," she whispered. "I saw something that Christmas, and I've never forgiven myself for staying silent. My heart began pounding harder. What did you see? She took a shaky breath before continuing. The night before that Christmas party, the one where your father announced Savannah's scholarship, I couldn't sleep. My husband was in the hospital with his heart troubles, and I was worried sick about him. I got up around midnight to make myself some warm milk, and I happened to look out my kitchen window. She gestured toward the window above her sink, which offered a clear view into my parents' backyard. I saw your mother standing by the fire pit. She had built a small fire, which struck me as odd because it was so late and so cold. She was burning papers, feeding them into the flames one at a time. I watched for a few minutes, not thinking much of it until the wind picked up. Mrs. Carter paused, her hands gripping the edge of the table. A page escaped the fire. It caught in the wind and flew toward the fence between our yards. Your mother tried to chase it, but she couldn't find it in the dark. She eventually gave up and went back inside. What happened to the page? I asked, barely daring to breathe. I found it the next morning caught in my rose bushes. It was partially burned, but I could still read some of it. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. It was a letter on Harvard University letterhead, and I could see your name Shelby, your name not your sister's. The room seemed to spin around me. You kept it. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly, shame evident in every line of her face. I didn't know what to do. I should have said something immediately. I should have confronted your mother or told someone what I'd seen. But I was afraid. She looked down at her hands. Your mother has a way of making people pay for crossing her. She's destroyed people in this community who got on her wrong side, spread rumors, turned friends against each other. My husband was sick and I couldn't risk any trouble that might affect his care or our standing in the church. Tears began rolling down her cheeks. So I hid the fragment in a box in my closet. I told myself I'd bring it forward if it ever became necessary, if anyone ever asked questions. But no one did. The years passed, and I convinced myself it was too late, that nothing good could come from stirring up old wounds. But I never threw it away. I couldn't. Do you still have it? I asked, my voice barely steady. She nodded and slowly pushed herself up from the table. I heard her footsteps move down the hallway, heard the sound of a closet door opening and boxes being shifted. When she returned, she carried a small wooden box, the kind that might hold jewelry or precious mementos. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lay a fragment of cream-colored paper with scorched edges. The Harvard letterhead was partially visible at the top, the crimson shield recognizable despite the fire damage. Below it, I could read fragments of text, including several words that made my heart stop: congratulations, and Shelby Torres, and a date that matched my acceptance letter. My mother had tried to burn the evidence of her crime, but the wind had preserved this single damning fragment. And Mrs. Carter, despite her fear, had kept it safe for 12 years. I'm so sorry, Shelby, Mrs. Carter said, her voice breaking. I should have been braver. I should have spoken up for you when you were just a child who couldn't defend herself. I let your mother silence me with fear, and you paid the price for my cowardice. I took her weathered hands in mine. You're speaking up now. That's what matters. Something shifted in her expression, the shame transforming into determination. That woman has been pretending to be a saint at church while she destroyed her own daughter. She's fooled everyone for years with her charity work and her prayer circles and her perfect family image. But I know what she really is, and I won't be silent anymore. She squeezed my hands with surprising strength. I'll tell everyone what I saw. I'll testify in court if that's what it takes. I'll stand in front of the whole congregation and describe watching her burn your future in that fire pit. You deserve justice, Shelby, and I need to make this right, even if it's 12 years too late. I embraced her then, this elderly woman who had carried guilt for over a decade and was finally ready to set it down. Her testimony would corroborate everything in my Harvard documents. The burned fragment she had preserved would provide physical evidence that my mother had deliberately destroyed correspondence meant for me. Combined with the forensic accountant's findings and the handwriting analysis, the case against my parents was growing stronger by the day. The woman who watched them burn my future was finally ready to help me rise from the ashes. Mrs. Carter's testimony and the burned fragment she had preserved gave my case powerful corroboration. But something continued to trouble me. The way Savannah had fled during my confrontation with our parents haunted my thoughts. Her pale face, her trembling hands, the desperate way she had escaped the room without meeting anyone's eyes. My sister had always been the golden child, the favored daughter, the one who received everything I was denied. But the woman I had seen that day did not look like someone enjoying the spoils of her privileged position. She looked like someone drowning. I decided to reach out to her directly, away from our mother's controlling presence. I knew from old family conversations that Savannah often walked in Riverside Park on weekend mornings, a habit she had maintained since childhood. The following Saturday, I drove to the park and found her sitting alone on a bench near the duck pond, her shoulders hunched and her face bearing the unmistakable evidence of recent tears. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When she looked up and saw me, panic flickered across her features, followed by something that resembled relief. I sat down beside her without asking permission, leaving space between us, but close enough to speak quietly. "I'm not here to attack you," I said gently. "I just want to understand." For a long moment, Savannah said nothing. She stared at the water where ducks glided peacefully across the surface, oblivious to the human drama unfolding on the shore. Then, something in her seemed to collapse, a wall crumbling that had been holding back years of suppressed truth. "I never finished Harvard," she whispered, the words tumbling out as if she could no longer contain them. "I was expelled during my sophomore year." The confession hung in the air between us. I waited, sensing there was much more she needed to say. "They caught me plagiarizing a paper for my economics class," she continued, her voice breaking. "I copied sections from a published article because I couldn't think straight anymore. The pressure was destroying me. I was supposed to be the perfect daughter, the brilliant Harvard student, the pride of the family. But I wasn't brilliant Shelby. I was just a girl who'd been put on a stage I never belonged on." Tears streamed down her face as the story poured out. She described the overwhelming weight of expectations she had never asked for, the constant terror that she would be exposed as a fraud, the anxiety attacks that left her unable to focus on her coursework. When the plagiarism was discovered, she had been called before an academic integrity committee that recommended expulsion. "I called Mom in complete panic," Savannah said, her hands twisting in her lap. "I thought she would comfort me, help me figure out what to do. Instead, she flew to Boston that same night, but not to support me, to control the situation." What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Their mother had withdrawn Savannah from Harvard immediately before the expulsion could be formally processed and recorded in ways that might become public. She had paid various administrative fees and made certain arrangements to ensure the circumstances of Savannah's departure remained obscure. Then she had brought Savannah home and constructed an elaborate fiction about taking a semester off for health reasons, followed by a triumphant return and eventual graduation with honors. "She made me lie to everyone," Savannah said, her voice hollow. "She coached me on what to say, what stories to tell, what memories to invent. She said if I ever revealed the truth, she would destroy me completely. She said no one would ever believe me over her, that she would tell everyone I was mentally unstable, that I would lose everything." I listened with growing horror as Savannah described the decade of deception that followed. Every family gathering, every church event, every conversation with relatives and neighbors required her to maintain the fiction of her Harvard success. She had memorized details about professors she never studied, with courses she never took, achievements she never earned. The constant performance had hollowed her out, leaving her a shell of anxious misery behind a carefully constructed mask. "But there's something worse," Savannah said, finally turning to look at me directly. "Something I've carried for years and never been able to tell you." She took a shaky breath. "About 4 years after Harvard, I was looking for some documents in Mom's office. She keeps a safe behind the bookshelf, and I knew the combination because I'd seen her open it. I found your Harvard acceptance letter in there, Shelby, the real one, along with other papers that showed what they'd done to you." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, even though I already knew the truth. Hearing that Savannah had discovered it years ago added a new dimension to the betrayal. I was horrified. She continued, tears flowing freely now. I finally understood why you'd ended up at that tiny college while I went to Harvard. I understood what Mom and Dad had stolen from you, and I knew I'd been living a lie built on the destruction of my own sister's future. Savannah reached up and touched a spot near the corner of her mouth. Looking closely, I could see a faint scar I had never noticed before, a thin line barely visible against her skin. I wrote you a letter, she said. I confessed everything. I told you about the documents I'd found about what they'd done, about how sorry I was for being part of their scheme, even though I hadn't known about it at the time. I was going to mail it to your apartment. I never received any letter, I said, though I already knew what must have happened. Mom intercepted it. She found it in my purse before I could send it. Savannah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She slapped me so hard I fell against the kitchen counter. That's where this scar came from. Then she grabbed my face and said something I've never forgotten. She closed her eyes as if the memory was too painful to face directly. She said Shelby must always be beneath you. That's how this family survives. You will never contact her about this. You will never tell anyone the truth, or I will destroy you both. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the scope of what Savannah had endured. I had spent years resenting her as the favored sister, the one who had received everything while I received nothing. I had assumed she was complicit in our parents' cruelty, that she had happily accepted her privileged position without concern for what it cost me. But the woman sitting beside me was not my enemy. She was another victim trapped in a different cage but imprisoned just as thoroughly. Our mother had destroyed both of her daughters, one through theft and dismissal, the other through impossible expectations and brutal control. Savannah had not been the villain of my story. She had been a prisoner just like me. I reached out and took my sister's hand. She flinched at first, then gripped my fingers with desperate strength. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I've wanted to tell you for years. I've wanted to beg your forgiveness. But I was so scared of what Mom would do. I've been trapped in her lie for so long I forgot what the truth even felt like." I squeezed her hand back. "You're not trapped anymore. Neither of us is. We can fight this together." For the first time in our adult lives, my twin sister and I looked at each other with understanding, instead of competition with compassion, instead of resentment. Our mother had designed our relationship to be adversarial, had set us against each other to maintain her control. But she had miscalculated. She had pushed us both too far. My sister had not been the villain, she had been a prisoner, and now for the first time, we could fight for each other. The conversation in the park opened a door that had been locked between us for our entire lives. In the days that followed, Savannah and I met repeatedly, no longer as rivals forced into competition by our mother's design, but as sisters discovering each other for the first time. We chose locations far from our parents' neighborhood coffee shops and quiet restaurants where we could talk for hours without fear of being observed and reported. Each meeting peeled back another layer of the lies we had both been living. I learned that Savannah had suffered from severe anxiety and depression for years, conditions that had gone untreated because seeking therapy would have meant explaining why she was falling apart. She described panic attacks that left her unable to leave her apartment, nights spent crying into her pillow while maintaining a cheerful facade during the day, the constant exhaustion of performing a role she had never wanted. The golden child I finally understood had been gilded with poison. In turn, I shared the realities of my own journey. The no-name college with its crumbling facilities and defeated professors. The 3 jobs that had left me permanently exhausted scrubbing toilets at dawn and entering data until midnight. The years of believing I was not good enough, of internalizing a rejection that had actually been theft. The slow, grinding work of building myself from nothing while everyone around me celebrated my sister's borrowed achievements. We cried together during those conversations, tears flowing freely as we mourned everything we had lost. Not just opportunities or money or credentials, but each other. We should have been close growing up, should have shared the bond that twins are famous for. Instead, our mother had deliberately positioned us as competitors, ensuring that any success for one would feel like failure for the other. She set us against each other our whole lives, Savannah said during one of our meetings, her voice thick with grief. Every time she praised me, she was really criticizing you. Every time she dismissed you, she was really threatening me. She made sure we could never be allies, could never compare notes, could never discover what she was doing. I nodded, understanding now how completely we had both been manipulated. We could have been best friends. We could have protected each other. I wanted to be your friend so badly when we were young, Savannah admitted. But Mom always found ways to create distance. She would tell me you were jealous of me, that you said cruel things about me when I wasn't around. She made me afraid of getting close to you. I remembered my mother making similar insinuations about Savannah throughout my childhood, subtle comments that painted my sister as arrogant and dismissive. Every barrier between us had been deliberately constructed by the woman who should have nurtured our bond. As our trust deepened, Savannah revealed that she had not come to our meetings empty-handed. Years of living under our mother's control had taught her to document abuse to create records that might someday serve as protection or proof. She produced a folder thick with evidence she had secretly accumulated. There were photographs of the documents she had discovered in our mother's safe years ago, images captured on her phone before she could be caught. The pictures clearly showed my Harvard acceptance letter, the forged declination form, and financial records that matched what my forensic accountant had uncovered. Savannah had risked severe consequences to create this documentation, knowing even then that someday the truth might need to be proven. More damning still were the audio recordings. After years of verbal abuse and threats, Savannah had begun secretly recording conversations with our mother. The files captured our mother's voice delivering threats with chilling clarity, warning Savannah never to contact me about Harvard, promising to destroy her if she ever revealed the truth. The recordings were admissible evidence of coercion and witness tampering. Finally, Savannah shared her journal entries from the time of her Harvard expulsion, pages filled with anguished handwriting that documented everything in real time. She had written about the plagiarism incident, about our mother's terrifying arrival in Boston, about the forced withdrawal, and the fabricated narrative that followed. The entries corroborated every detail of the story she had told me in the park. Combined with my Harvard documents, the forensic accountant's financial analysis, and Mrs. Carter's testimony about the burned letter, we now possessed an overwhelming case. My lawyer, Diane Morrison, nearly dropped her coffee when I presented the complete collection of evidence during our next meeting. "This is remarkable," she said, paging through the materials with widening eyes. "Your sister's recordings alone would be enough to prove coercion. Combined with everything else, your parents have no viable defense. This case is airtight." But Savannah and I had discussed our approach extensively, and we had decided that legal action alone would not be sufficient. Our mother had built her power on 3 pillars: financial stability, legal impunity, and social reputation. We intended to dismantle all 3. I explained to Savannah what I had already set in motion on the financial front. My company had quietly acquired our parents' mortgage debt from their struggling bank, purchasing it at a discount through a subsidiary that could not be traced back to me. They had no idea that their only hope for keeping their home now rested in the hands of the daughter they had robbed. When the time was right, I would have complete leverage over their financial future. The legal assault would proceed through Diane Morrison's office. The evidence we had compiled supported multiple charges: mail fraud for intercepting my Harvard correspondence forgery for my father's signature on the declination form, financial fraud for misappropriating my scholarship funds. Additional charges could potentially be brought for coercion of Savannah and destruction of evidence. Our parents would face consequences in court for every crime they had committed. But it was the social dimension that I knew would wound our mother most deeply. She had spent decades constructing her reputation as a pillar of the church community, a devoted mother, a model of Christian virtue. That false image was the foundation of her identity and her power. When the truth emerged publicly, when her fellow parishioners learned what she had done to her own daughters, the facade would crumble beyond repair. We planned to reveal everything at a community gathering with witnesses present who could not be dismissed or silenced. Mrs. Carter had already agreed to stand with us and share what she had seen. Other neighbors and church members who had witnessed my mother's favoritism over the years would be present to hear the full story. The woman who had played the saint would be exposed as the monster she truly was. Savannah looked frightened when we discussed the public exposure. A decade of threats had conditioned her to fear our mother's retaliation. I took her hands in mine and made a promise I intended to keep with everything I had. "We're not just getting revenge," I told her. "We're getting free. Both of us. This is about breaking her power over us forever, not just punishing her for what she did. And no matter what happens, no matter how she tries to fight back, you're not alone anymore. We face this together." Savannah's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in our adult relationship, they were tears of hope rather than despair. She squeezed my hands back with a strength I had never felt from her before. "Together," she repeated. "I've been waiting my whole life to say that word and mean it." We had been raised as rivals, but we were about to become our mother's worst nightmare sisters who finally knew the truth. With Savannah firmly by my side and our combined evidence creating an unassailable case, it was time to execute the strategic plan we had developed together. The first phase would target the financial foundation of our parents' world, the assets they had built using my stolen scholarship money. Justice required that those assets now become instruments of accountability. I had already laid the groundwork weeks earlier before Savannah and I had even reunited. My company, Silver Life Technologies, operated through several subsidiary entities for various business purposes. One of these subsidiaries, a holding company called Beacon Asset Management, specialized in acquiring distressed debt portfolios from struggling financial institutions. It was a legitimate business practice common throughout the financial industry, and it provided the perfect vehicle for my purposes. My parents' mortgage was held by a small regional bank that had been hammered by economic downturns and poor lending decisions. The bank was actively selling off distressed assets to improve its balance sheet, and my parents' repeatedly late payments had placed their mortgage squarely in the distressed category. Through Beacon Asset Management, I made an offer to purchase their mortgage at a discount, along with a bundle of other similar loans, to avoid drawing attention to any single transaction. The bank accepted eagerly. They received immediate capital to shore up their reserves, and I received legal ownership of my parents' debt. The transaction was completed with the same routine paperwork that accompanies thousands of similar deals every month in the American financial system. My parents received a standard notification letter informing them that their mortgage had been transferred to a new servicer. They had no reason to suspect anything unusual, no way of knowing that the new holder of their debt was the daughter they had robbed and dismissed. I now possessed legal authority over the family home. The same house where I had stood invisible at Christmas parties while everyone celebrated Savannah's stolen achievements. The same house where my mother had called me a disgrace and my father had lied about Harvard never contacting me. The same house they had renovated and improved using money that should have funded my education. They continued sleeping there, making their monthly payments, believing they were slowly working toward ownership. They had no idea that their daughter already controlled their most significant asset. The financial positioning was only one element of the strategy. The legal assault proceeded simultaneously through Diane Morrison's office building toward a confrontation my parents could not escape or deny. We filed the formal civil lawsuit in federal court, the venue necessary because mail fraud is a federal offense. The case was styled Torres versus Torres, my name appearing as plaintiff, against both my mother and father as defendants. Seeing those names arranged in opposition on legal documents felt surreal, a formal declaration of war against the people who had given me life, and then systematically worked to limit what I could do with it. The complaint was comprehensive, detailing every element of my parents' crimes with surgical precision. Mail fraud for intercepting opening and responding to correspondence addressed to me specifically, the Harvard acceptance letter, and related scholarship materials. Forgery for my father's signature on the scholarship declination form a document that required my personal authorization but was signed without my knowledge or consent. Fraudulent conversion of educational benefits for redirecting my scholarship funds to their personal accounts and investments. Intentional infliction of emotional distress for the deliberate psychological harm caused by their deception, including years of making me believe I was inadequate when they knew the truth. The damages we sought reflected the true scope of what had been stolen. The full value of the scholarship itself, $120,000, plus 12 years of compound interest that money would have earned. Lost career earnings calculated by an economist who compared typical outcomes for Harvard graduates versus graduates of institutions like the one I had actually attended. Punitive damages for the deliberate and malicious nature of their actions intended to punish wrongdoing severe enough to warrant additional consequences beyond mere compensation. The total amount sought exceeded $2 million. But money was not what I truly wanted. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted my parents to stand in a courtroom and face the consequences of what they had done. I wanted the truth spoken aloud in a setting where their denials would be demolished by evidence they could not dismiss or explain away. To ensure that evidence was unimpeachable, I hired Dr. Marcus Webb, one of the country's foremost forensic handwriting analysts. His credentials included decades of experience testimony in hundreds of cases, and a reputation for meticulous accuracy that made his conclusions virtually impossible to challenge. I provided him with multiple samples of my handwriting collected over the years, along with the scholarship declination form bearing the forged signature. Dr. Webb's analysis was definitive. The signature on the declination form, he concluded with 97% confidence, was not written by me. The letter formations, pen pressure patterns, and subtle stylistic elements were inconsistent with my authentic handwriting samples. Furthermore, when provided with samples of my father's writing collected from birthday cards and other documents, Dr. Webb identified significant similarities. The same unusual formation of certain letters, the same characteristic slant, the same pressure patterns. While he could not state with absolute certainty that my father had written the signature, he could confirm that it matched my father's writing far more closely than it matched mine. The expert was prepared to testify in court to stand before a jury and explain in professional terms what the evidence demonstrated. Combined with Mrs. Carter's eyewitness testimony, Savannah's recordings and photographs, the Harvard records, and the forensic accountant's financial analysis, we had assembled a case that left no room for reasonable doubt. Diane Morrison called me after reviewing the complete evidence package. "In 20 years of practicing law, I've rarely seen a case this strong," she said. "Your parents' attorney will almost certainly advise them to settle once they see what we have. They'll want to make this go away, quietly pay some money, and avoid the public exposure of a trial." I had anticipated this. Settlement would give my parents an escape route, a way to buy their way out of consequences while maintaining their public image. That was not acceptable. "I don't want a settlement," I told Diane. "I want a trial. I want the truth read into the public record. I want them to sit in a courtroom and hear exactly what they did in front of witnesses and cameras and anyone who cares to watch." Diane paused before responding. "That's your right as a plaintiff. But you should understand that trials are unpredictable. Even with evidence this strong, juries can surprise you. And the emotional toll of testifying against your own parents, of having your family's private horrors exposed to public scrutiny, is significant." "I've spent 12 years carrying the weight of their lies," I replied. "A few days of public testimony is a small price for the truth." She agreed to proceed toward trial rather than negotiating settlement. The machinery of justice began moving forward, carrying my parents toward a reckoning they had never imagined possible. They continued their daily routines, unaware of the forces converging against them. They made payments on a mortgage I now controlled. They consulted lawyers about the lawsuit, probably still believing they could deny and deflect their way to safety. They attended church and maintained their social facades, not knowing that the foundations beneath them were already crumbling. They were sleeping in a house they no longer truly owned, and they had no idea their daughter held the key to their entire future. The lawsuit notification arrived at my parents' home on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who required their signatures. I was not present, of course, but I learned the details later from multiple sources. The legal complaint was thick, running to dozens of pages that detailed every element of their crimes with cold precision: specific dates, specific dollar amounts, specific actions. The document made clear that whoever had filed this case possessed intimate knowledge of their finances and their deceptions. My parents contacted a defense attorney within hours. Gerald Whitmore was a local lawyer with experience in civil litigation, a man accustomed to property disputes and contract disagreements rather than allegations of fraud and forgery. When he reviewed the complaint and the attached evidence list, his confidence reportedly drained away. The evidence list alone was devastating: Harvard University records, forensic accounting analysis, handwriting expert testimony, eyewitness statements, audio recordings, photographic documentation. Each item represented another nail in the coffin of their defense. According to sources who later shared details with me, Whitmore met with my parents privately after his initial review. His assessment was blunt. "This case is extremely strong," he told them. "The evidence they've compiled is comprehensive and professionally gathered. You should seriously consider what a settlement might look like, because going to trial will likely expose everything publicly. I'm talking newspapers, community awareness, potentially even television coverage depending on how this develops. A trial will destroy your reputation regardless of the verdict." My parents apparently struggled to comprehend how their invisible daughter had built such a formidable case against them. They had dismissed me as jealous and delusional during our confrontation. They had assumed their denials would be sufficient to make the accusations go away. Now they faced legal documents that treated their crimes as established facts, backed by evidence they could not simply wave aside. The financial pressure began mounting almost immediately. Legal fees consumed what little savings they had remaining after the Torres Realty Ventures collapse. Whitmore required a substantial retainer before he would proceed, and his hourly rate carved through their dwindling resources with alarming speed. Meanwhile, their mortgage payments continued coming due, processed now through the subsidiary I controlled. They made those payments on time, terrified that any additional financial problems would worsen their already precarious position. They had no idea they were sending checks to their own daughter. Desperate for cash, my parents began liquidating assets. The boat went first listed with a marine dealer who found a buyer within weeks, but years of depreciation and poor maintenance meant they received barely a third of what they had originally paid. The jewelry my mother had accumulated followed pieces she had worn to church events and social gatherings to project an image of refined prosperity. The resale market for used jewelry proved brutally disappointing. Country club memberships that had cost thousands annually were allowed to lapse, cutting my parents off from the social circles they had cultivated so carefully. The cracks in their public image became visible to the community they had worked so hard to impress. Neighbors noticed the for sale signs appearing in front of the boat and the second car. They noticed my parents skipping church potlucks and social events they had previously attended religiously. They noticed the landscaping service being canceled, the grass growing longer between increasingly infrequent mowings, the house developing the subtle shabbiness of deferred maintenance. Whispers began circulating through the church congregation. The Torres family, once pillars of the community, was clearly experiencing difficulties. Some speculated about medical problems or family emergencies. Others, with the cruelty that small communities sometimes display, wondered aloud whether the Torres' reputation had always been inflated. My mother, who had built her identity on being admired and envied, could feel the shift in how people looked at her. The deference was fading, replaced by curiosity and pity. In her desperation, my mother turned to the weapon she had always relied upon most heavily: Savannah. She called repeatedly over several days, leaving voicemail messages that alternated between pleading and demanding. When Savannah did not respond, my mother escalated to showing up unannounced at her apartment, pounding on the door until neighbors threatened to call the police. Finally, Savannah answered one of the calls. I was sitting beside her when it happened, offering silent support as she prepared to sever the last cord of manipulation. My mother's voice crackled through the phone speaker, audible from where I sat. "Savannah, sweetheart, I need you to come home. We're dealing with some legal nonsense from your sister, and I need you to make a statement supporting us. You know how jealous Shelby has always been. We just need you to tell the lawyers that her claims are ridiculous, that the family has always been loving and supportive." Savannah's response was ice cold, delivered with a steadiness that came from years of suppressed truth finally finding release. "I know what you did to Shelby. I've always known. I found the documents years ago, remember? You hit me when I tried to tell her. You threatened to destroy me if I ever revealed the truth." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When my mother spoke again, her voice had shifted to something between desperation and anger. "I don't know what you think you found, but you're confused. You've always been fragile, sweetie. That's why we protected you. That's why we gave you opportunities. You owe this family everything." "I owe you nothing," Savannah replied. "You used me as a prop to make yourselves look good. You destroyed my sister's future to create the illusion that I was successful. And you've spent my entire adult life threatening me into silence. I'm done. I'm done being your puppet. I'm done pretending. And I'm standing with Shelby." She ended the call before my mother could respond. Her hands were shaking, but her expression showed relief rather than fear. The puppet had finally cut her own strings. I learned later from Mrs. Carter, who observed my parents' household with renewed attention, that my mother's reaction to Savannah's defection was extreme. She became paranoid, convinced that neighbors were spying on her, that church members were plotting against her, that the entire community had somehow been turned against her by outside forces. She accused Mrs. Carter directly during one encounter, demanding to know what she had told people about the Torres family. "Your daughter asked for my help," Mrs. Carter replied calmly. "And I told her the truth. I told her what I saw you burning in that fire pit 12 years ago." The color drained from my mother's face. For the first time, she understood that the walls closing in around her were not the result of jealous conspiracy, but of truth finally emerging from the shadows where she had buried it. She retreated into her crumbling home, the beautiful renovations now mocking her with reminders of how they had been funded. The woman who had controlled every narrative, manipulated every relationship, and crushed every threat to her authority found herself facing circumstances she could not spin or deny or escape. Her husband retreated into silent depression, barely speaking, avoiding his wife as much as possible within the confines of their shared prison. The partnership that had destroyed their daughters' futures was itself disintegrating under the pressure of consequences finally arriving. But I knew my mother too well to expect quiet surrender. She had built her life on manipulation and control, and she would not abandon those tools simply because they had failed her so far. Even as her world collapsed around her, she was surely planning her counterattack, searching for leverage. She could use weaknesses, she could exploit allies, she could recruit to her cause. Their empire of lies was cracking, but Mother was not ready to surrender. She was preparing to fight back. My mother's counterattack came swiftly and viciously, deploying every manipulative skill she had honed over decades of controlling narratives and destroying anyone who threatened her carefully constructed image. I had underestimated her willingness to burn everything down rather than accept accountability. That miscalculation nearly cost me everything I had built. The first strike came through the media. A local newspaper reporter contacted me for comment on a story they were developing about family conflict and elder abuse allegations. Confused, I asked what they were referring to. The reporter explained that a concerned citizen had provided them with information about a wealthy businesswoman who was systematically destroying her elderly parents through financial manipulation and frivolous lawsuits. The source claimed the daughter was mentally unstable, driven by jealousy and irrational hatred, using her money as a weapon against helpless seniors who had done nothing but try to love her. The story ran the following week, under a headline that made my stomach turn: "Millionaire daughter accused of targeting elderly parents in cruel financial attack." The article quoted my mother extensively, her words carefully crafted to present herself as a bewildered victim of inexplicable cruelty. She spoke of sleepless nights wondering where she had gone wrong, of tearful prayers asking God to heal her daughter's troubled mind, of the heartbreak of watching a child she had loved unconditionally turn against her for reasons she could not comprehend. The reporter had made minimal effort to verify her claims or seek my perspective before publication. The story spread through social media with the viral momentum that outrage always generates. Comment sections filled with condemnations of wealthy people who abandoned their parents of ungrateful children who forgot the sacrifices made on their behalf. People who had never met me formed fierce opinions about my character based entirely on my mother's fabrications. The narrative she had spun was simple and emotionally compelling: innocent elderly parents versus cruel rich daughter. Nuance and truth had no place in such a story. Simultaneously, my mother filed a counter-lawsuit against me, alleging elder abuse, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The legal documents were professionally prepared, clearly the work of a competent attorney she had somehow retained despite their financial difficulties. The lawsuit sought damages and, more importantly, an injunction against my ongoing campaign of persecution. The filing created additional media coverage, generating headlines about dueling lawsuits between family members and reinforcing the impression that this was a bitter personal vendetta rather than legitimate pursuit of justice. But my mother was not content to attack only my public reputation. She targeted my professional life as well, striking at the foundation I had spent years building. Letters arrived at the offices of my investors and business partners, each one carefully worded to avoid outright defamation while still planting seeds of doubt. She described me as emotionally volatile and prone to obsessive behavior, suggesting that anyone associated with me should carefully consider whether I was a stable partner for their business interests. William Chen. My earliest and most important investor called me directly after receiving one of these letters. His voice carried concern rather than accusation, but the fact that he felt the need to address it at all demonstrated the effectiveness of my mother's attack. "I've known you for years, Shelby, and I've never seen any sign of instability," he said. "But I have to ask directly, is there anything about this family situation that might affect Silver Life? Investors get nervous when founders are embroiled in public controversies." I explained the truth as concisely as I could, promising to provide documentation if he needed it. William accepted my explanation, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. Even supporters who believed me would naturally question whether associating with me was worth the trouble. My mother had understood this perfectly. She did not need to convince everyone I was unhinged. She only needed to create enough doubt to damage my relationships and undermine my position. The familiar shame washed over me in waves. Despite everything I had accomplished, despite the evidence proving my parents' crimes, my mother still had the power to make me feel small and worthless. Her disapproval had shaped my self-image for so long that even now, knowing the full truth of what she had done, part of me instinctively believed I must deserve this treatment. The church community rallied around her with predictable loyalty. My mother had spent decades cultivating her reputation among those congregants, leading prayer groups, organizing charity events, projecting an image of devoted Christian motherhood. When she appeared at a Sunday service, looking frail and tearful, speaking in trembling tones about her troubled daughter's attack, sympathy poured out from every direction. She organized a special prayer circle dedicated to her family's healing, positioning herself at the center as a suffering mother seeking divine intervention for a wayward child. Longtime church members who had known our family for years expressed outrage at my supposed cruelty. Some approached my parents after services to offer support and condemn my actions. The narrative my mother had constructed was taking hold, transforming her from defendant into victim in the eyes of everyone who mattered to her. I began receiving anonymous messages, hateful communications that arrived through email, social media, and even my company's general contact information. People I had never met called me a disgrace, accused me of abandoning Christian values, suggested I would burn in hell for persecuting my own parents. Some messages contained threats vague enough to avoid legal consequences, but disturbing enough to make me check my locks twice before sleeping. For the first time since beginning this pursuit of justice, I felt my resolve wavering. The cost was mounting faster than I had anticipated. My reputation, my business relationships, my peace of mind, even my physical safety felt threatened by my mother's scorched earth response. Perhaps settlement would be wise after all. Perhaps I should accept whatever financial compensation the lawyers could negotiate and walk away from the public confrontation I had demanded. I was sitting alone in my apartment surrounded by printed copies of the hateful messages, wondering whether justice was worth the price when my phone rang. Mrs. Carter's name appeared on the screen. "I've seen the newspaper articles," she said without preamble. "I've heard what people are saying at church. Your mother is telling everyone you've lost your mind that you're persecuting her for no reason." "I know," I replied, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "She's winning. She's turning everyone against me just like she always does." "She's doing what she's always done," Mrs. Carter agreed. "But this time is different. This time she doesn't know what's coming." The elderly woman's voice carried steel I had rarely heard from her. "Don't you dare give up now, Shelby. I have a plan. I've spoken with Pastor Williams, and he's agreed to give me time to address the congregation at next month's community meeting. Your mother thinks she controls that church. She's about to learn otherwise." I felt something shift in my chest, the despair loosening its grip as hope reasserted itself. Mrs. Carter had watched my mother manipulate that community for decades. She knew every deception, every false image, every lie that had been told from the pulpit of supposed righteousness, and she was ready to tear it all down. "There are others who will stand with you," Mrs. Carter continued. "People who have seen things over the years, people your mother thought she had silenced or fooled. When the time comes, you won't be alone. The truth has more allies than your mother realizes." I thanked her with tears in my voice, grateful beyond words for this woman who had finally decided to fight after years of watching from the sidelines. My mother believed she had won the narrative war, believed her manipulations had once again protected her from consequences. She was about to discover how wrong she was. She had turned the world against me once, but this time I had witnesses she did not know about, and truth she could not destroy. The monthly church community meeting was scheduled for the last Saturday of the month, a tradition that had continued for decades in the congregation my parents had attended since before I was born. These gatherings served as part social event and part business meeting, a time for announcements, updates, and occasional discussions of matters affecting the church family. My mother had used these meetings for years to reinforce her position as a community leader, always volunteering to organize, always positioning herself at the center of attention. She arrived that Saturday, expecting the same adulation she had cultivated through her recent prayer circles and tearful performances. According to those who witnessed her entrance, she walked in with the confidence of someone assured of victory, greeting longtime friends with the warm smile she deployed so effectively. She had no idea that Mrs. Carter had requested time on the agenda, no idea that the woman who had watched her burn my Harvard letter 12 years ago was about to share that burden with everyone present. I sat in the back of the fellowship hall with Savannah, both of us invisible in the crowd of congregants settling into folding chairs. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Everything we had planned, everything we had gathered and prepared came down to this moment. If Mrs. Carter's testimony fell flat, if the community rejected her account, my mother would emerge stronger than ever, her victim narrative validated by the congregation's support. Pastor Williams opened the meeting with routine announcements, his voice steady and unremarkable as he covered scheduling changes and volunteer needs. Then he paused and consulted his notes before continuing. "Before we proceed to new business, Mrs. Evelyn Carter has requested time to address the congregation. Evelyn has been a member of this church for over 50 years, and I believe we all know her as a woman of deep faith and unquestionable integrity. Mrs. Carter, the floor is yours." My mother's expression flickered with confusion as Mrs. Carter rose from her seat and made her way slowly to the front of the room. At 82 years old, Leaning on her cane, she looked fragile but determined. She took her place behind the podium and surveyed the assembled congregation with eyes that carried the weight of long-suppressed truth. "Many of you know me as a quiet woman," she began, her voice surprisingly strong. "I've attended this church longer than most of you have been alive. I've watched families grow, watched children become parents, watched this community through good times and bad, and I've stayed silent about things I should have spoken up about years ago." She paused, her gaze finding my mother in the crowd. 12 years ago, on the night before a Christmas party at the Torres home, I couldn't sleep. I was worried about my husband, who was in the hospital at the time. I looked out my kitchen window and saw something that has haunted me ever since. The room had gone completely silent. Even the usual rustling and coughing that accompanied any gathering had ceased. I saw Elena Torres standing by her backyard fire pit burning papers. One page escaped the flames and landed near the fence between our yards. The next morning, I retrieved it. Mrs. Carter reached into her purse and withdrew a plastic sleeve containing the scorched fragment she had shown me weeks ago. This is what I found. A piece of a Harvard University letter with Shelby Torres's name clearly visible. Elena had burned her own daughter's acceptance letter to Harvard. Gasps rippled through the congregation. My mother half rose from her seat, her face contorting with outrage, but Pastor Williams raised a hand to silence her. "Let Mrs. Carter finish," he said firmly. Mrs. Carter continued, her voice gathering strength as years of suppressed guilt finally found release. "I watched that family for decades. I watched Elena praise Savannah endlessly while treating Shelby like she didn't exist. I watched that poor girl work herself to exhaustion trying to earn approval that never came. And I stayed silent because I was afraid. Elena Torres has a way of destroying people who cross her, and I was too cowardly to risk it." She turned to address the congregation directly. "The woman you've been praying for, the woman who told you her daughter was persecuting her for no reason, stole her own child's future. She forged documents, intercepted mail, and used money meant for Shelby's education to fund her own lifestyle. I've seen the evidence. It's overwhelming. And I'm here to tell you that everything Shelby has claimed is true." The room erupted. People turned to each other with shocked expressions. Some called out questions. Others demanded clarification. In the chaos, other voices began rising, witnesses I had not known existed stepping forward to share what they had observed. A woman named Patricia, who had lived down the street from my parents, described noticing my mother's unusual behavior around the mailbox during the spring of my senior year. "She would practically run to get the mail every day," Patricia recalled. "I thought it was strange at the time, but I never imagined why." Robert Chen, a retired postal worker who had delivered mail to our neighborhood for 20 years, confirmed that my mother had specifically asked him to hand-deliver any correspondence from universities directly to her rather than leaving it in the mailbox. "She said she wanted to be sure nothing got lost," he explained. "I didn't think anything of it then. Now I understand." Family friends who had attended countless Torres gatherings over the years spoke about the disparity they had witnessed in how my parents treated their daughters. The favoritism had been obvious to anyone paying attention, they admitted, but they had assumed it was none of their business. I rose and walked to the front of the room carrying the folder of evidence I had prepared. With Pastor Williams' permission, I presented the key documents: my Harvard acceptance letter, the forged scholarship declination bearing my father's handwriting, the financial records showing how my scholarship money had been spent. I explained the forensic analysis, the expert testimony that would be presented at trial, the comprehensive case that left no room for innocent interpretation. Church members who had condemned me based on my mother's narrative sat in stunned silence as the scope of the deception became clear. The same people who had sent me hateful messages now stared at their hands, unable to meet my eyes. My mother could no longer contain herself. She stood up, her face flushed with fury, and shouted across the room, "This is all lies. Fabricated documents. My daughter has always been jealous and disturbed. You've all known me for years. Are you really going to believe this nonsense over everything I've done for this community?" The room fell silent, waiting to see how her challenge would be met. That was when Savannah rose from her seat beside me and walked to the front of the hall. The congregation watched in confusion as the favored daughter, the one they had been told was the victim of her sister's jealousy, took her place at the podium. "Everything Shelby has said is true," Savannah declared, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I know because I discovered the evidence years ago. I found the documents in my mother's safe. I tried to warn Shelby, but my mother intercepted my letter and physically attacked me to keep me silent." She touched the faint scar near her lip. "She told me that Shelby must always be beneath me, that this was how our family survived. She threatened to destroy me if I ever revealed the truth. I've been living as her puppet for over a decade, forced to pretend to be something I'm not, terrified of what she would do if I spoke up." The congregation turned to stare at my mother, and I watched the social structure she had built over decades collapse in real time. Her oldest friends looked at her with expressions of dawning horror. Women she had led in prayer circles stared as if seeing a stranger. The pastor's face had hardened into something approaching disgust. "Elena," Pastor Williams said quietly, "I think it would be appropriate for you to step down from your leadership positions while these matters are sorted out." My mother's response was pure venom. "I will do no such thing. I built this women's ministry from nothing. I have given decades of my life to this church. You cannot ask me to step aside based on the ravings of two ungrateful daughters and a senile old woman." The outburst sealed her fate. Whatever sympathy might have remained evaporated as the congregation witnessed the real Elena Torres stripped of her careful performance, revealing the cruelty and arrogance that had always lurked beneath. Pastor Williams asked two deacons to escort her out when she refused to leave voluntarily. She went screaming accusations, her dignity shattered beyond repair. By the end of the meeting, the woman who had ruled this community's social hierarchy for decades had been utterly exposed. Her life's work of reputation building had collapsed in a single evening. She had built her throne on my stolen dreams, and I watched it crumble around her. The public exposure at the church community meeting had stripped away my mother's social armor, but the legal reckoning still awaited. The civil trial began 6 weeks later in a federal courthouse downtown, the result of months of preparation, depositions, and procedural maneuvering. By the time opening statements were delivered, the case had attracted significant local media attention. The story of a successful businesswoman suing her own parents for stealing her Harvard scholarship proved irresistible to journalists covering the human interest beat. The courtroom gallery filled with spectators each day of the proceedings. Some were community members who had witnessed my mother's downfall at the church meeting and wanted to see the legal conclusion. Others were strangers drawn by news coverage, curious about the family drama that had captured public attention. A few reporters occupied the press section, taking notes for stories that would appear in evening broadcasts and morning papers. My mother sat at the defense table with her attorney, her face set in an expression of aggrieved dignity that fooled no one who had seen her true nature revealed. My legal team presented our case with methodical precision, building the narrative of deception piece by documented piece. Diane Morrison opened by outlining the timeline of events from my Harvard application through the discovery of truth 12 years later. She described each crime in clinical terms: mail fraud, forgery, financial fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The jury listened with expressions that shifted from curiosity to horror as the scope of parental betrayal became clear. The Harvard records came first, authenticated by a university official who had traveled from Massachusetts to testify. She confirmed that my application had been accepted with a full scholarship, that a declination form had been received bearing what appeared to be my signature, and that the scholarship funds had been dispersed to the address my parents had provided. The documents were projected on screens for the jury to examine, my name clearly visible on the acceptance letter that should have changed my life. Dr. Marcus Webb followed, presenting his forensic handwriting analysis with the confident authority of an expert who had testified in hundreds of cases. He walked the jury through his methodology, explaining how he had compared the signature on the declination form with authenticated samples of my handwriting. His conclusion was unequivocal: the signature was not mine. Furthermore, when compared with samples of my father's handwriting, significant similarities emerged. The jury examined enlarged images of the signatures following Dr. Webb's pointer as he identified the telltale characteristics that revealed the forgery. Patricia Huang, my forensic accountant, presented the financial trail with equal precision. She traced the scholarship funds from Harvard's disbursement through my parents' bank accounts and onward into their failed real estate ventures and luxury purchases. Charts and graphs illustrated the flow of money that should have funded my education, but instead supported their lifestyle and ambitions. The jury watched as 12 years of financial deception was laid bare in numbers that could not be denied or explained away. Mrs. Carter took the stand in the afternoon of the second day, and the courtroom fell silent as she described what she had witnessed. Her voice carried the weight of 12 years of suppressed guilt, steady now with the conviction of someone finally unburdening a heavy secret. She told the jury about the fire in the backyard, the paper that escaped the flames, the Harvard letterhead with my name visible on the scorched fragment. She produced the fragment itself, preserved in its plastic sleeve, and it was entered into evidence as physical proof of my mother's destruction of mail intended for me. "I should have spoken up then," Mrs. Carter said, her eyes meeting mine across the courtroom. "I was afraid of what Elena might do to me if I interfered. But my silence made me complicit in what happened to Shelby. I've carried that guilt for 12 years, and I'm grateful for the chance to finally tell the truth." Savannah's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. She walked to the witness stand with visible trepidation, avoiding our mother's burning glare as she took her seat. Under Diane's gentle questioning, she described her own victimhood in devastating detail, the pressure to be perfect, the punishment when she failed the expulsion from Harvard that our mother had concealed through manipulation and money. She told the jury about discovering my Harvard acceptance letter in our mother's safe, about the horror of realizing the truth about the letter she had tried to send me that was intercepted. Her voice broke when she described the physical violence that had followed the slap that had left a scar near her lip, the threat that had silenced her for a decade. "She told me that Shelby must always be beneath me," Savannah testified, tears streaming down her face. "She said that was how our family survived. She made me complicit in destroying my own sister's future, and she threatened to destroy me if I ever tried to make it right." The jury watched my mother's face as her own daughter described her manipulation. I watched too, searching for any sign of remorse or shame. There was none. Her expression showed only fury, the rage of a woman who had controlled everyone around her for decades and could not accept that her power had finally been broken. The defense presented a weak case hampered by the overwhelming evidence against them. My mother's attorney attempted to paint me as a jealous daughter seeking revenge for perceived slights, but the documented proof made such arguments hollow. My mother took the stand, briefly maintaining her denial, even as the evidence piled against her. Her performance might have been convincing once, but the jury had seen too much truth to believe her lies. Closing arguments took half a day, after which the jury retired to deliberate. They returned in less than 4 hours with verdicts that vindicated everything I had suffered and fought for. Guilty on all civil counts: fraud, forgery, intentional infliction of emotional distress. My mother and father were held jointly liable for the forgery and fraud, with my father's direct participation in signing the declination form, making his culpability undeniable. The financial judgment exceeded $500,000. The original scholarship value, 12 years of compound interest, additional damages for lost educational opportunities, and punitive damages reflecting the deliberate malice of their actions. The judgment would consume whatever assets my parents had remaining and likely pursue them for years to come. The judge delivered her summary with barely concealed disgust. "This case represents a profound betrayal of parental duty," she declared, looking directly at my parents. Rather than supporting their daughter's earned success, these defendants deliberately destroyed her opportunities to maintain a preferred family narrative. They committed federal crimes, forged documents, and built their lifestyle on stolen funds intended for their child's education. The court finds their conduct reprehensible. My mother's countersuit alleging elder abuse and harassment was dismissed entirely as frivolous. The judge noted that the lawsuit appeared designed solely to muddy the waters and intimidate the plaintiff, and she warned my mother's attorney about potential sanctions for filing baseless claims. I sat in the courtroom as the verdicts were read, feeling something I had not expected. Not triumph exactly, not even satisfaction. Something more like exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that comes after a battle that has consumed every ounce of strength. The law had validated my truth. My parents would face consequences for what they had done. But as I watched my mother's face harden with unrepentant fury, I realized that legal victory was not the same as closure. The court could assign liability and award damages, but it could not explain why. It could not answer the question that had haunted me since childhood. Why had she chosen to destroy me rather than simply love me? The law had delivered its verdict, but the deepest truth was still waiting to be revealed. The courtroom emptied slowly after the verdicts were announced, spectators filing out with the satisfied murmur of people who had witnessed justice delivered. My legal team gathered their documents, already discussing next steps for collecting on the judgment. Savannah waited for me near the exit, her face showing the same mixture of exhaustion and relief that I felt. But as I rose to join her, I noticed my mother still sitting at the defense table alone, now that her attorney had departed. Something in her posture stopped me. The rigid defiance that had characterized her throughout the trial had collapsed. Her shoulders curved inward, her head bowed, her hands lying motionless on the table before her. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, diminished in a way that went beyond legal defeat. I told Savannah I needed a moment and walked toward the defense table. My mother did not look up as I approached, did not acknowledge my presence until I sat down in the chair her attorney had vacated. When she finally raised her eyes to meet mine, I saw something I had never witnessed in her face before: complete and utter defeat. Why? The question I had carried since childhood emerged as barely a whisper. Why did you hate me so much? For a long moment, she said nothing. Then the carefully constructed walls she had maintained for decades began crumbling, and words spilled out in a torrent of confession. I was the younger of 2 children, she began, her voice hollow. My brother Michael was brilliant. Teachers adored him. My parents worshipped him. He was accepted to Harvard when I was 15, and from that moment forward I ceased to exist in my own family. She stared at her hands as she spoke, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. My parents told me I wasn't college material. They said I should focus on finding a good husband since I wasn't smart enough for anything else. Everything in our house revolved around Michael's achievements, Michael's future, Michael's glory. I was invisible. I was nothing. The parallel to my own childhood struck me with painful clarity, but I remained silent, letting her continue. I swore my children would never feel what I felt. I would control their futures. I would decide who succeeded and who didn't so that no child of mine would ever be dismissed the way I was dismissed. Her voice cracked. But then you came along, Shelby, and from the moment you could speak, I saw myself in you. Your intelligence, your independence, your determination to succeed on your own terms. She finally looked at me, and her eyes held something between confession and accusation. You were going to leave and never look back. You were going to outgrow us, outshine us, become something so far beyond this family that we would be nothing but footnotes in your story. Savannah needed me. Savannah could be shaped and guided and kept close, but you were always going to escape. The twisted logic of her cruelty finally revealed itself. So I made sure you couldn't. I made sure you would struggle, would doubt yourself, would never reach the heights I knew you were capable of reaching, because if you succeeded, if you became everything I could see you becoming, then what would I be? Just the mother of someone greater than me, invisible again, nothing again. She laughed a broken sound without humor. I chose Savannah not because I loved her more, but because I could control her. And in trying to keep her close, I destroyed her too. I broke her with pressure and expectations and threats until she couldn't function without my permission. I didn't love either of you. I used you both to fill the emptiness my own parents carved into me." I sat in silence, processing the revelation. I was looking at a woman who had taken her childhood wounds and transformed them into weapons against her own children. She had experienced the pain of being overlooked and dismissed, and rather than healing, rather than giving her daughters what she had been denied, she had recreated the same trauma and forced us to live it. "You could have healed," I said quietly. "You could have given us everything you never had. You could have broken the cycle instead of perpetuating it. But you chose to become exactly what hurt you." My mother's face crumpled. "I thought I was protecting my family. I thought I was staying in control so that no one could ever dismiss us the way my parents dismissed me. But I wasn't protecting anyone." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I was protecting myself. And I destroyed everyone anyway." There was no satisfaction in watching her collapse, no joy in finally understanding the source of her cruelty. Only a profound sadness for the generations of pain that had brought us to this moment. Her parents had wounded her. She had wounded us. The cycle had perpetuated itself across decades, leaving destruction in its wake. But understanding did not equal forgiveness. Knowing why she had hurt me did not erase the years of suffering, the stolen opportunities, the shattered self-worth I had spent a decade rebuilding. Her trauma explained her actions, but did not excuse them. She had made choices at every step, choices to harm, rather than heal, to destroy, rather than nurture. I stood up from the table and looked down at the broken woman who had once seemed so powerful. "I'm sorry for what your parents did to you," I said. "But I will not carry your pain forward. The cycle ends with me." She had turned her wounds into weapons, but I refused to carry that cycle forward. My mother's confession had illuminated the psychological origins of her cruelty, but it had not addressed the other figure who had participated in destroying my future. My father had signed the forged document. His handwriting had appeared on the declination form that erased my Harvard acceptance. The law had held him jointly liable, but I had not yet confronted him directly about his role in what had been done to me. The request came 3 days after the trial concluded. My father called my office and asked if he could visit, specifying that he wanted to come alone. The emphasis on that word struck me. In all my memories of my parents, I could not recall a single significant conversation with my father that had not occurred in my mother's presence or under her direction. He had always been a satellite orbiting her dominant gravity, reflecting her light rather than generating his own. He arrived at Silver Life's headquarters looking like a man who had aged decades in a matter of weeks. His suit hung loosely on a frame that seemed to have shrunk, and his face carried the gray pallor of someone who had stopped sleeping. When my assistant showed him into my office, he stood uncertainly near the door, as if unsure whether he had the right to occupy space in my world. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, and he sat down with the careful movements of someone whose body had become unfamiliar. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat and began. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice cracking on the words. "I knew it was wrong. Every day for 12 years, I knew what we had done to you was wrong. I watched you struggle through that college, watched you work those jobs, watched you build yourself from nothing while believing you weren't good enough for Harvard." His hands trembled in his lap. "And I said nothing. I did nothing. I told myself that staying quiet meant I could still watch you grow up, still be part of your life in some small way. But that was just cowardice dressed up as love." I listened without interrupting, watching this diminished man grapple with confessions he should have made years ago. "Your mother has always been the strong one," he continued. "From the day we married, she made the decisions. At first I thought it was partnership, her handling what I wasn't good at. But over the years it became something else. She decided where we lived, how we spent money, how we raised you girls, what we believed, and who we associated with. I surrendered everything to her piece by piece until I barely existed as my own person." He described the night my mother had presented her plan to switch the Harvard letters. He had objected, he claimed, had told her it was wrong to steal my acceptance and give it to Savannah. But his objection had been weak, easily overcome by her certainty and her contempt for his hesitation. She told me you would be fine, that you were tough enough to succeed anywhere, that Savannah needed the opportunity more than you did. She said she knew what was best for this family. He shook his head slowly. And I believed her. Or I told myself I believed her. Because saying no to her seemed impossible. Because fighting her meant losing everything I had left. He looked up at me with eyes that held no expectation of mercy. I signed that paper because she told me to sign it. I forged your name because she handed me the pen. I'm not telling you this to excuse what I did. There is no excuse. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I saw you. Even when I failed to protect you, even when I participated in destroying your future, I saw you. I knew you deserved better. And I did nothing. The silence stretched between us as I processed his words. I had spent years believing both my parents had dismissed me equally, had considered me unworthy of their investment or attention. Learning that my father had recognized the injustice while still participating in it created a more complex picture, one that was somehow both better and worse than simple indifference. I don't forgive you, I said finally. Maybe I never will. What you did caused real harm that shaped my entire adult life. Your weakness doesn't excuse your choices. He nodded, accepting the judgment without protest. But I understand that you were weak, not evil, I continued. You didn't orchestrate what happened to me. You enabled it. You went along with it. You lacked the courage to protect your own daughter. That's a different kind of failure than what Mother did, and it helps me know who to hold accountable for what. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. If you want any relationship with me going forward, it has to be independent of her. No more enabling. No more passive compliance. No more pretending you don't see what she is and what she does. If you can't exist as your own person separate from her control, then we have nothing to build on. Tears streamed down his weathered face. I should have been your father first. Before I was her husband. Before I was afraid. Before I was weak. I should have chosen you. I should have protected you. I'm sorry I never had the courage until it was too late. He rose slowly from the chair, looking somehow both diminished and freed by the confession. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. I'm proud of you, Shelby. I always was. I was just too much of a coward to say it when it mattered. He left my office carrying the weight of his failures, but perhaps also the beginning of something that might eventually become accountability. I watched him go, feeling the strange mixture of anger and pity that complicated relationships always generate. The law had judged them both, but I still had one final act of justice to deliver. The conversations with both my parents had provided a kind of closure, even if that closure was incomplete and imperfect. I understood now why my mother had become the person she was, and I understood why my father had failed to stop her. Neither understanding translated into forgiveness, but both helped me see them as damaged humans rather than inexplicable monsters. That clarity freed me to make decisions about the future without being consumed by the past. The first decision surprised everyone who knew the full story of what my parents had done. I held the mortgage on their home through my subsidiary company. The court judgment entitled me to collect over $500,000 from them. Combined, I had complete power to destroy them financially, to force them from the house they had lived in for 30 years, to leave them with nothing but the consequences of their crimes. I chose not to exercise that power. Instead, I instructed my attorneys to restructure the mortgage into a payment plan my parents could actually afford, stretching the judgment collection over decades rather than demanding immediate satisfaction. They would keep their home at least for now. They would have enough to survive, if not to thrive. My legal team questioned the decision. Savannah questioned it too, wondering why I would show mercy to people who had shown me none. My answer surprised even myself as I spoke it aloud. I won't destroy people the way they destroyed me. That's not who I want to be. I thought about my mother's confession about the cycle of pain that had passed from her parents to her to me. They will know every day that the roof over their heads exists, because I chose mercy when they gave me none. They will live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives. That's enough. It was power without cruelty, control without destruction. I had proven I could demolish their world completely, and then I had chosen not to. The distinction mattered to me in ways I was still learning to articulate. The more important work lay in building something meaningful from the wreckage of our family history. Savannah and I spent weeks discussing how we might transform our painful experience into something that could help others. The idea emerged gradually, shaped by conversations and research, and our shared understanding of what it meant to have educational opportunities stolen by people who should have protected them. We established the Second Chances Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing scholarships and support for students whose educational paths had been blocked or stolen due to family circumstances. The foundation would fund tuition for students who had been denied opportunities through parental manipulation, financial fraud, or family dysfunction. Beyond financial support, we would offer counseling services for adult survivors of narcissistic family abuse, recognizing that the psychological wounds often persisted long after the practical obstacles had been overcome. I provided the initial funding from my own resources, and the story of our family's trial brought unexpected donations from people who had experienced similar betrayals. Within the Foundation's first year, we helped over 200 students reclaim educational paths that had been blocked or stolen. Each scholarship recipient represented a cycle, interrupted a future, reclaimed a life redirected toward possibility rather than limitation. Working together on the foundation gave Savannah and me a shared purpose built on truth rather than the competition our mother had engineered between us. For the first time in our lives, we were allies rather than rivals, sisters, rather than pawns in someone else's game. I used part of my resources to purchase a small home for Savannah in a quiet neighborhood far from our parents' shadow. She was finally receiving professional treatment for the anxiety and depression that years of manipulation had caused. The therapy was difficult, forcing her to confront trauma she had suppressed for over a decade, but she approached it with courage I had not known she possessed. The sister I was discovering bore little resemblance to the golden child I had resented throughout our youth. That person had been a performance. The real Savannah was someone I genuinely liked. She enrolled in community college that fall, pursuing the education she had never truly received at Harvard. Without the pressure of impossible expectations, without the threat of our mother's judgment, she discovered a genuine passion for psychology. She talked about eventually becoming a counselor herself, helping others escape the kinds of family dynamics that had nearly destroyed us both. Carter became a fixture in our new lives, a surrogate grandmother whose presence filled the void left by our biological family. She joined us for Sunday dinners at Savannah's new home, bringing her famous peanut butter cookies and stories from her 8 decades of life. She had carried guilt for 12 years over her silence, and helping us now seemed to bring her peace. The three of us formed an unlikely family unit bound not by blood, but by choice and shared experience. I watched my sister laugh at something Mrs. Carter said, her face relaxed in a way I had never seen during our childhood. I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment, the years of struggle and discovery and confrontation. I had set out seeking justice and found something more valuable: liberation. Not just for myself, but for both of us. The family we were building was healthier than the biological one had ever been. We had constructed it deliberately, choosing each other rather than being assigned by accident of birth. The foundation we had created would help others do the same, would interrupt cycles of harm and open doors that cruel parents had tried to close. I had rebuilt everything they destroyed. And then Harvard called. The call came from a number I did not recognize with a Massachusetts area code that made my heart skip unexpectedly. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the president of Harvard's Women in Business Association, and her words seemed to arrive from an alternate universe where justice had a sense of poetry. They wanted me to deliver the keynote address at their annual leadership conference. The invitation, she explained specifically, noted my journey as an entrepreneur who had built a multi-million-dollar company despite facing significant educational obstacles. I represented proof that achievement is determined by character rather than credentials. Would I be willing to speak to their members about resilience, leadership, and success? I accepted without hesitation. The day of the speech arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of perfect New England weather that appears in university brochures. I walked through Harvard Yard with the conference organizers passing buildings I had studied in photographs as a 17-year-old girl dreaming of a future that would be stolen from her. The red brick facades, the ancient trees, the students hurrying between classes with backpacks and coffee cups. This should have been my world. Instead, I was entering it for the first time as a 30-year-old woman who had earned her place through a much harder path. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and alumni, all waiting to hear from someone the program described as an inspirational figure in American entrepreneurship. I stood backstage reviewing my notes, feeling the weight of everything this moment represented. Then I walked to the podium, looked out at the sea of expectant faces, and began to speak. I was supposed to stand in these halls as an 18-year-old student. I said, my voice steady despite the emotion swelling in my chest. I was accepted to this university with a full scholarship based on my academic achievements. But that acceptance was stolen from me by the people who should have protected me most. Instead of walking these paths as a student, I arrive at 30, as proof that no one can permanently steal your potential. I told them everything. The Christmas party where my sister's stolen achievement was celebrated while I stood invisible in the corner. The years of working 3 jobs to pay for an education at a school no one had heard of. The discovery of the forged documents and the stolen scholarship money. The trial and the verdict and the mother who had turned her own childhood wounds into weapons against her children. But I did not stop with the betrayal and the revenge. I spoke about cycles of harm and the choice to break them. I spoke about the sister I had lost to our mother's manipulation and found again through shared truth. I spoke about Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor who had finally found the courage to testify after 12 years of silence. I spoke about the Second Chances Foundation and the hundreds of students we had already helped reclaim educational paths that had been blocked or stolen. Success is not about the institution on your diploma, I told them. It is about the person you become through struggle. It is about refusing to let anyone else's cruelty define your limits. It is about building something meaningful even when the world tells you that you are not worthy. When I finished speaking, the audience rose to their feet. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity, waves of sound washing over me as I stood at the podium in the institution that had been taken from me and reclaimed on my own terms. Afterward, when the handshakes and photographs and congratulations had finally ended, I walked alone through Harvard Yard at sunset. The campus had emptied of its daytime crowds, leaving only the ancient buildings and the golden light filtering through autumn leaves. I passed the dormitory, where I would have lived, the library where I would have studied, the paths I would have walked as a young woman full of dreams and possibilities. I allowed myself to grieve for her, that 18-year-old girl who had lost this dream through no fault of her own. I mourned the years she should have spent here, the friendships she should have formed, the education she should have received. That grief was real and valid and deserved its moment of acknowledgement. Then I remembered everything I had built anyway. A company that served thousands of elderly Americans. A foundation that helped students reclaim stolen futures. A sister who was finally free. A chosen family built on truth rather than blood. And most importantly, a life defined by my own choices rather than my parents' cruelty. I pulled out my phone and called Savannah. When she answered, I spoke 3 words that carried the weight of everything we had survived together. It's over. I'm finally free. Her laughter echoed through the phone, mixing with my own, carrying across the ancient campus, where I had finally claimed my rightful place. They stole my future once, but I built one they could never touch. And this time, it was mine forever. Shelby's story has come to a close, but the message she leaves behind will resonate for a long time. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who cause the deepest wounds. But that does not mean we have to let the past dictate our future. Shelby proved that resilience and determination can transform pain into power and injustice into motivation to rise. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next inspiring stories. What do you think about Shelby's decision to choose mercy instead of completely destroying her parents? Have you ever experienced unfairness from your own family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every comment you leave is valuable encouragement for us to continue bringing you more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching until the end.